Good morning. Thanks for being here today. First, I'd like to thank the university for having lent us their facilities. I'd like to thank the psychometric applications and models chairs, and I hope that this meeting will meet your expectations. First, I'd like to give the floor to Francisco Santolaya, who's the chairman of the General Council of Psychologists Official Associations, and he has the floor. Thank you very much. As usual, it seems that technology and psychology are at odds, but that's not true. Let me just briefly thank Vicente and the organizers of this seminar. I'd like to thank them for their invitation. And I'd like to thank them for two reasons. First, because I can show the interest of my organization in supporting psychometrics and measurement, and also because this enables me, as a psychology student, to avoid the endless pieces of paper we used to use. With technology, everything has changed. Technology is very important in human resources and measurement. We've seen that with ISO 10677 and with human resources managed. We think psychology should have the support of new technologies and should be supported by tests. And psychology should be a major part of what human resources departments in companies do. Galileo Galilei used to say that everything that can be measured should be measured, and what can't be measured should be measurable. And this means that one of the scientific developments and one of the factors that has made psychology a science are the tools that we psychologists have been able to develop to measure skills in a context of reality. I think that's very important, and those tools and items that are used should be able to set rules so that we can apply psychology to corporations. Thank you for having invited me, and you have our full support. Thank you. Let me briefly introduce why we're here. The Institute of Knowledge Engineering is a nonprofit organization. It was established in 1989. We have celebrated our 27th anniversary, and we have also held a recent seminar. We are somewhere in between university, where research and takes place and knowledge is generated, and the market. Algorithmic engineering measures different things, and our aim is to create solutions that the market needs. We're fortunate to be somewhere between the two, and we see what the market needs are, and we are also very close to university. We sponsor the chair of psychometric models. What we see is that talent and human resources are increasingly important. We see there's a need to measure the human value in organizations. The aim is to have an objective idea of what the human value of an organization is worth, how we identify talent, how that aligns with organizations, and so on. And that is based on the research work of this chair, which enables us to provide solutions to the market and to place value on that intangible, which are human resources. That's why we've been working with this chair for several years, and we continue to do it because it's increasingly necessary. Our customers want solutions, and we need to turn to universities so that we can find solutions to meet the market needs. And that's the reason we're here. And I'd like to thank this chair, which cooperates with us. Let me now give the floor to Vicente Gonzada, who will now introduce the speakers. Thank you very much. Good morning. As usual, let me start by thanking the university, the faculty, the Institute of Knowledge Engineering, also the General Council of Psychology. Thanks to the fact that it has provided streaming, anybody can access, wherever they are, can access the seminar. We started last year, and we're doing it again this year. I'd also like to thank the speakers. This year we have a speaker from South Carolina, Nancy Tippins, from Oviedo, Antonio García, who's sitting here, and Madrid, Francisco Aval. I'd like to thank you also, those of you who are here every year, and I'd like to thank those who are following this seminar through streaming. I'd also like to thank the European Association of Work and Organizational Psychology, that has actively promoted the seminar, and we hope that members from that organization will be connecting to the streaming service. We will be hearing first from Nancy Tippins. After that, we will have a coffee break for coffee and posters, 10 posters, 5 more practical, 5 of a more theoretical nature. They've been grouped in 2 parallel sessions. They'll be chaired by Carmen García and Ana Valera, whom I would like to thank. The parallel sessions will take place in the annex building on the ground floor. You go out of this building, turn left and left again, and you'll find the annex to this building. So it's on the ground floor. You can also go through the cafeteria downstairs. You'll go out in the courtyard, and right across the cafeteria, you'll be able to find the lobby of the parallel sessions. This year, coffee will be served at the cafeteria's terrace. It seems that it's going to be a very nice day, so we'll be able to have a coffee there. Each of the poster speakers will have 5 minutes to describe their work. We want these sessions to be open and that people can move around from one session to the other while drinking coffee. People can eat, drink, move from one poster session to the other. After Nancy's first talk, we'll have 15 minutes to have coffee. At 10:55 sharp, the 2 parallel sessions will start. After that, once the posters sessions are finished, we'll be hearing from Nancy again. And then we'll also be hearing from Antonio García Izquierdo and Francisco Abad. And if we have time, we will have a Q&A session. In any case, the last 20 minutes of the seminar will be a question and answer session, and also a stock-taking session. We have Wi-Fi here. You have the access codes with your program. Let me now introduce the first speaker, Dr. Nancy Tippins. Nancy is a senior vice president of CEB Inc. CEB has taken over major companies in the past few years, such as SHL and Valterra. Jesus Salgado, Pepe Munir, Philip Levens, Anne-Marie Rayan, and Paul Sackett have been at this seminar. They're both very prominent, and they're in academia. This year, we can add Nancy Tippins, who certainly meets that first description, but not the second one. She's not a university professor. She's a professional who has such a top position after having, she has a top position after having had lots of top positions. She's not in academia, but she still publishes a lot of articles on staff selection and measurement. And she also writes about how technology contributes to improving assessments. In 2015, she published Technology and Assessment and Selection in the annual review. We've asked her to speak about two things. The title is Technology and Assessment. First, she's going to talk about the more theoretical aspects, and then she'll be showing us a case study, which she's fully acquainted with, thanks to her experience. Nancy, thanks again for being here in Madrid. Thanks for taking part in our seminar. Julio Lea's not here this year. He had to leave yesterday for serious personal reasons, and that's the reason he's not here this year. But next year, both of us will be here again. Nancy, please.
You don't need
Yeah, I don't need
now.
this right here.
Okay. Or if you prefer to walk, or you can also use this.
Okay,
What you prefer?
that'd be great. This would be great.
Would you like to use this?
Mhm.
Let me. Okay. Okay.
Buenos días. Estoy muy contenta de estar aquí con ustedes en Madrid y hablar de uno de mis temas favoritos, pruebas, evaluación y tecnología. Mi español es terrible. Estoy tratando de aprenderlo y lo poco que sé decir son frases como un cerveza, por favor. No es muy útil hoy, por tanto voy a hablar en inglés. That is all the Spanish I will say today. I cannot speak Spanish. I am very happy to be here and to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is testing and technology. I've done a lot of work in this area, and as Vicente said, I have a very practical orientation. My experience is not in the university. It is in practice working with companies, primarily in the United States, but some outside of the United States, in developing tests and measurements that are used for a variety of reasons: selection, promotions, certifications, and even for development. of managers and executives. So I have a little bit of a bias towards the kinds of things I will say regarding the practical uses of technology and how we can apply those to assessments and testing. Whoop. I forgot to tell you, this is what I just said. So just to be clear, I want to make sure you all understand what I mean when I say technology-enhanced assessments. When I talk about technology-enhanced assessment, I mean any assessment in which one or more of the components of the assessment process is enhanced by the use of technology. And that could be the administration, the scoring, the reporting, or even the data storage. And again, technology-enhanced assessments can be used for many, many different purposes. And I'll talk about a number of different applications. Primarily pre-employment selection is what my examples are related to. So to give you a little bit more idea about, I think that's just the battery cover. So to give you a better idea of how technology is used in different ways in assessment, I wanted to give you an idea of the kinds of applications that we might see. So there are multiple forms of technology. It's not just computers. It could be laptops, could be tablets. In the U.S., we talk about phablets, which is a combination. They're big phones and little tablets. It could be the telephone. It could be video equipment. And video equipment could relate to small pictures, still pictures, or it could be animation, or it could be cameras that capture the response of the test taker. It could also be simply audio. All of these kinds of things are technology and can be applied in the testing situation. There are different kinds of software that people use. It can be test administration software, which typically uses a computer to present the items and capture the responses of the individual. It could be a scoring tool. It could be a scanner that reads an optical scan sheet and records the responses of the individual. It could be a database that processes dynamic norms so that you can choose what country and what level of position you want to compare the test taker's score to. I want to know how a manager in Spain would do on average, so I can compare this individual to that group rather than to someone in the United States who is applying for an entry-level retail job. There are report generators that can generate different kinds of reports depending on the use of the assessment. So, for example, you might have an assessment report that simply says this person is qualified or not qualified, that might be used by the hiring office, the personnel office, to decide, am I going to hire this person or not? Or it could be a developmental report for an executive who's going through a development program to say, you're really strong in these skills and you're not so strong in these skills, and here's where you might pursue developmental activities. There are in-basket tools that will present an in-basket so that you have a day in the life of an executive and gives a very realistic work sample kind of approach to testing. There are assessment portals that allow you to aggregate the different kinds of assessments that you might use in order to get a full picture of the individual's capabilities. And then more recently, there are data mining tools that are used with big data. Big data is the rage in the United States, and I think probably all over the world, where psychologists are going into existing databases and pulling out information, developing algorithms that are used to predict future job performance. And sometimes those algorithms use data that are only come from application blanks. Sometimes those data come from social media, Facebook, all kinds of places. There are also multiple test formats to which this technology is applied. It can be multiple choice. In the U.S., at least, that's very traditional. There's a question, 4 response options. You choose what the right answer or the best answer is. It could be matching. It could be used for constructed responses where you have to give a short sentence, or perhaps you give a much longer response in response to the scenario that's presented to you. And then there can be absolutely no format, such as in big data, where the test taker may not even be aware that he or she is being evaluated. And then technology can be used to evaluate multiple constructs. You can have a single KSAO. In the United States, that's a very frequently used term, and it stands for knowledge, skills, abilities, and other personal characteristics. And those are typically the kinds of variables or psychological constructs on which we build tests. It can be multiple KSAOs. For example, it can be a personality test that measures the big 5 different personality scales, or perhaps the facets of the big 5. It could be something like arithmetic word problems that combines both arithmetic and reading. And it could be very narrowly defined construct like conscientiousness only, or a broadly defined construct like problem solving. So the purpose today, I want to define some of what I think are the critical questions about technology-enhanced assessments, and then present the research that at least addresses those questions. I'm not sure we have the answers for a lot of them, but we do have some research that gives us an idea of the direction we're headed. I also want to talk about the implications of the research findings and of the questions that we're asking on employment testing programs. What kinds of concerns should we as practitioners have in using technology for employee selection, and then highlight some of the unanswered questions that still remain. So I have a list of 11 questions that I want to address, and they range from the very basics about validity and reliability to just what are my general anxieties about testing. There's one question in here I'll hit very lightly. It's the second one about adverse impact. That is a U.S. legal term, and it is very, very important in the United States. And I raise it simply because if any of you all want to work internationally and have any idea of working in the U.S. market, you need to be aware of this and some of the concerns we have. So the first question I want to ask or pose to you all is the assessment valid and reliable when it is enhanced by technology? Validity and reliability are fundamental to any measurement that we use. If it's not valid and it's not reliable, or if we don't know if it's valid or reliable, then I think we have to question the business use of the tool and understand that we don't know whether it is adding value to the business and is really going to help the business achieve its goals. So without validity and reliability, I would argue we don't use those tests at all. So let's talk a minute about high-fidelity simulations. We call those work samples, and those are things like you have someone who's doing electronic repair, and you have an electronic repair problem, and they have to troubleshoot the equipment and find out what's wrong and then fix it. Or it might be a customer service simulation where you have someone deal with an angry customer, and then the candidate is rated on his or her response. The validity of these things is almost unquestioned. They are a sample of the actual work. And so people say, well, this is what we do on the job, it must be okay. Most of the work samples are validated using what we call a content-oriented approach. And I found out recently, working with some people in other parts of Europe, that content-oriented validity is not a well-known or well-used approach to establishing evidence of validity. But in the United States, we use this a lot. And what we do is we try to establish a relationship between the constructs that the test measures, the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other constructs that are required on the job as established by a job analysis and the essential task of the job. And the linkage between the test, the KSAOs, and the task is established by subject matter experts. There have been a few criterion-related studies reported in the literature that's written in English that I can read. The big one is the meta-analysis of Schmidt and Hunter in 1998, and they estimated the validity of work samples to be 0.54, which is pretty high. Roth and his colleagues in 2005 estimated the meta-analytic validity to be a little bit lower, to be 0.34. So there's nothing in work samples to indicate that the addition of technology would in any way affect the validity. In fact, if technology is what is used on the job, then adding technology would seem to have no impact on the validity of the instrument itself. There is one study in the published literature that I have found by a man named Jeff Casina, who published in 2013 a study that I'll talk a little bit more when I talk about case studies, and he actually found pretty low validities for his video-based test. It was to assess people who work for the United States Custom and Border Patrol. These are the people that say you can come in or outside of the, or come into the U.S. And his uncorrected validities are quite low, I think, 0.096 to 0.114, and corrected 0.148 and 0.180. Interestingly, the criteria that he used are not the traditional job performance criteria, but they are linkages to other kinds of measures. So I'm not too concerned that his validities are terribly low. But I think that the caution here is that generalizing from one study is probably not a good idea, that who knows what went on in this study. We don't really know all the details. It certainly raises some concern, but overall it appears that the validities of technologically enhanced work samples is quite robust. A number of researchers have worked on low-fidelity simulations. These are typically things like situational judgment inventories, where the candidate is given a scenario and then giving 3 to 5 options on what the response might be, and asked to say this is the best response or this is the worst response. Sometimes they're actually asked to rate the response on a scale of how good is that response. Levens and Patterson in 2011 found that the validity of low fidelity simulations were similar to those of high fidelity simulations. So a low fidelity simulation might be written on paper. A high fidelity simulation you might have the scenario presented in a video. Sometimes you'll see even the response options presented in video. The validities are essentially the same. The 0.36 versus 0.37, that's really not a lot of difference. The similarities of the validities is very important from a practice perspective, because as I'm sure you all know, it is very, very expensive to develop high fidelity simulations that use video. It costs a lot of money unless you're doing it with your own video with your cell phone and doing those, and those don't work too well in most big organizations. So you really have to take a deep breath and decide, is this the best way to spend my resources in pre-employment selection or promotional selection to take the time to film this based on this one study. There is evidence that's contrary to the Levens and Patterson study that was also done by Levens and Sackett, and that indicated that the high fidelity in the stimulus and the response led to greater validity. So jury's out here, I think. It's not exactly clear what the importance of fidelity is and what its impact is on validity, but it's certainly a question that we need to be asking with respect to practice. So let's talk a minute about reliability. Excuse me. Talk a minute about reliability. Anytime you have a work sample and it has to be evaluated by a human assessor, there's a question about the reliability of that human assessor. So to me, the reliability of the work sample is contingent upon the tools that you give the assessor to ensure consistent scoring across assessor, time, location, etc. You want to make sure that everyone is scoring these things in exactly the same way. Again, technology doesn't really seem to have much of an impact, except in those cases where technology helps to record the response so that the evaluator is not relying on his or her memory, but can actually go back to a videotape or an audio tape and see or hear this is exactly what the candidate said, and presumably improve the accuracy of the scoring process. So in summary, most of us believe that high-fidelity simulations have high criterion-related validity, even though the study hasn't been done. It's based on the extraordinary content validity data that we usually collect, and that we assume that the reliability is good, but we do recognize that it's dependent upon the tools that are given the actual assessors. In contrast, when we talk about the validity of an UIT, UIT is an unproctored internet test. And these are quite the rage in many parts of the world. You give a test to a candidate, and the candidate may take that test any place he or she chooses. It can be at home in front of the TV, it can be in a library, it can be on a cell phone in a bus, it can be any place. And there's lots and lots of concerns about the validity of these instruments. So there are a number of frequently asked questions that are critically important. The first is, does the UIT have lower validity than the proctored version of the test? Again, the results aren't very clear because a lot of these studies are not published in the accessible literature in our country. Maybe yours is different, but we have very difficult time getting anything but anecdotal evidence or evidence that's shared with just a few people. The rationale behind this question, the reason we ask it, is that it is presumed that if you have an unproctored test, you, the candidate, have an opportunity to cheat. You can get additional information, you can get someone else to take the test for you. There are lots of ways that you can cheat. And if a person cheats, a significant number, and if a significant number of people cheat, then the assumption is there's lower reliability of the test. The test is not an accurate reflection of an individual's capabilities. You don't know. And we know that if the reliability is low, that validity is attenuated. Interestingly, the research that's published doesn't always confirm this assumption. There's a study that's getting kind of old now, but Kaminsky and Hemingway in 2009 found comparable validities when they compared one test given in proctored settings and tests given in unproctored settings. There was actually a meta-analysis several years later by Beatty and his colleagues, and Jim found that the meta-analysis showed that the validities of proctored and unproctored tests tended to be comparable. Now, that was not a head-to-head study of the same test, so you have to be very careful in how you interpret these data. Perhaps from a practice point of view, the essential question is not, is one set of validities higher or lower, but is the validity of the unproctored test sufficient to use for business purposes? Are you going to spend your company's money or your client's money using a test that may have lower validity? Is that validity enough to be useful? And the jury on that one seems to suggest that the validity of an unproctored internet test is sufficient. Most studies find a significant validity coefficient that is strong enough to warrant its use in business and industry. The reliability of these tests, well, there are different kinds of reliability, so it's difficult to assess. If you're looking at internal consistency, yeah, they're reliable. If you're looking at test-retest, it depends on the conditions of the retest, and I'll talk a little bit more about verification testing in a minute. But still, there is this concern that a single individual test score may not be reliable simply because a person had the opportunity to cheat, and some percent actually did. So I leave you with a couple of questions regarding unproctored internet testing. And the first question is, should we use UIT despite the questions about its validity? Are we okay doing that? And my answer is it really depends on the situation and the evidence that we have to support a specific test. I personally am very concerned about having evidence that supports a particular test with a particular population for a particular use. I'm unwilling to go to a test publisher, even my own, and say, this test was valid here for this company and this job, therefore it's okay for me to use it. There needs to be some evidence, some chain of linkages between the validity study that I'm going to use to justify my test and my current situation, if not a full-blown criterion-related validity study. The second question, I think, is really unanswerable. How reliable is a single individual's test score? We do not know who cheats. We know some people cheat, but we can't say, you cheated, I cheated. We don't know that. And unless there is a confession, we don't know. And then a particularly important question for those of us who work with clients in business and industry is, what are the benefits relative to the cost? So we know that the cost is related to, well, we don't know. Often we believe that the cost is diminished validity, but at the same time there are benefits to unproctored internet testing. Typically it expands the applicant pool and you have many more people applying for a job. Now whether that's good or bad depends on your situation, but the real issue for business is, what is the cost-benefit ratio, and is it sufficient to justify the use of that test? So let's talk a minute about this adverse impact issue. And I want to just give you a real quick tutorial on what adverse impact is, because it's such a big deal in the United States. And if you don't ever intend to work in the U.S., you can forget everything I say, so I'll spend 3 minutes on it and move on. But it refers to a ratio between the proportion of the minority test takers passing a test relative to the majority of the test takers. In the U.S., majority and minority are typically defined by race, so Caucasians, white people are the majority, and black people and Hispanics. Hispanic in the U.S. is typically people who have come from South America or Latin America, not from Spain. I'm not sure whether you'd be Hispanic or Caucasian. That's an interesting question. I'll have to go research. It also includes women in many jobs, and so our anti-discrimination laws are focused on this ratio, and you absolutely must demonstrate that if your test has adverse impact, meaning that the racial minority or women don't pass at a sufficient rate relative to the majority group, you must demonstrate that your test is A, job relevant, and B, consistent with business necessity. And consistent with business necessity are legal terms that typically refer to the validity of the test. Because of the extreme sensitivity of these data, they're rarely reported in the literature. This is what you can get sued for, and some of these suits are in the millions and millions of dollars. I worked on a case a couple of years ago. The settlement, it never went to trial, was $26.9 million because someone was not used a test that was not passing minorities at a high enough rate. So these are big. There are lots of ways to calculate adverse impact in the United States. Most of them use some form of statistics, either a chi-square or a Fisher's exact probability. Keep in mind that all of these statistics, the larger the sample size, the more likely it is to be statistically significant. So you may have very small practical differences, but very large statistical differences. There's some evidence that simulations, there's some evidence that simulations actually reduce adverse impact. Several studies, Olson, Buchanan, and Schmidt and Mills, found that video assessments reduced adverse impact. And Casino, the one with the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, said they had no adverse impact in their studies. And there does seem to be a real advantage to using things that are not requiring reading and that cognitive load that's associated with reading complex materials. Can you all hear me if I don't use this? Is this okay? So, just beware that if you use a test in the United States, you need to attend to this issue about subgroup differences and make sure that there are not significant differences there. So that's all I'm going to say about that. If you want to talk more about it, I'm certainly happy to talk at length about it at the break. So let's talk a minute about cheating on unproctored internet tests and whether or not it really matters. Does it occur? There does appear to be a small amount on unproctored tests. There appears to be a small amount on proctored tests. The extent of cheating is very difficult to determine, and everybody uses a different method, so it's hard to compare to say, yes, everyone is agreeing that this percent cheats or that percent cheats. One study uses an effect size. They compared the differences in scores on proctored and unproctored job simulations, and they found an effect size of 0.32, which is pretty small. Winfred Arthur does a lot of work in this area, and he comes up with a number of about 7.7%. But he defined cheating as a difference of one standard error of measurement. Levens and Burke have done some work in this area. This is an interesting study. They looked at D-scores between on 4 different tests, and they found that some tests were higher in the proctored setting and other test scores were lower in the proctored setting. What's interesting about this, and what you really have to read between the lines when you read these studies, they're not always comparing the same group of people. So in this particular study, they gave the unproctored test to a large number of people, but they only invited the top scores to come in to take the proctored test. And the proctored test signified that you were on your way to getting a job. You passed one hurdle, you were going to the next hurdle. So there is reason to believe that the mean score of the proctored group should be larger than the mean score of the unproctored group, not because of the nature of the testing environment, but because of the differences in the capabilities of those two samples of people. So be really careful when you look at the literature. I did want to point out the Nye study in 2008. They found no differences in unproctored and proctored testing on perceptual speed tests, and that's a typical finding in the U.S. at least, simply because there's not a lot of opportunity to cheat unless you actually have a substitution. Someone else takes the test for you. Those kinds of tests go so quickly, you don't have time to say, what's the answer to 32? You have to just put something down and keep moving. So I think there are a couple of questions to be asked from a practical point of view. One is, how can cheating be detected? Well, there's direct observation of the test behavior, and that would be a proctoring situation where you have some sort of monitor who can look and say, it looks like you two are sharing answers. Some people look at changes in means and standard deviations and pass rates over time. Importantly, that is a retrospective way of detecting cheating. It also is not going to identify who cheated. It will simply say cheating is going on here in this group of people. Unusual response patterns are often used. You know, when the test taker gets the easy items wrong and the hard items right, correct, something's not right there. How can that be? And you expect a few anomalies. There is guessing, but when it's consistent, you know that this individual has been given some sort of assistance, whether it's pre-knowledge of the test or assistance during the test. You don't know, but something's going on there. A number of people have used very sophisticated statistical techniques. I've listed some of the references here. They are quite complicated, but again, they are looking at very large data sets, things like testing for the entrance exam into colleges in America, or the military testing. If you have a large data set with thousands of applicants, it's possible to do that. In most companies, you're not testing that many people for one job. I think the biggest employer in the United States is Walmart. It's a big retail company, and they test about 1 million people a year, but not for the same job. So in most companies, they'll test 40, 50,000 people for a populous job, and for a job that doesn't have a lot of incumbents, you may only test 1 or 2 people a year. So statistical detection is hard to do on those kinds of jobs. So rather than ask the question of can cheating be detected, another approach is to ask, can cheating be prevented? Can you do something to stop it? And lots of people have done different things. One is proctoring, and we've talked about the human proctor. And there is evidence that proctoring will reduce cheating when there is a right and wrong answer. Importantly, it has little effect on self-description inventories like personality tests. It doesn't matter whether the proctor is sitting there or not. I can promise you I am really conscientious, I'm a really nice person, and the proctor can't do anything about me basically distorting my responses. A number of authors, though, have pointed out that proctoring is not the gold standard, and I think that's important to remember, that lots of cheating goes on despite the presence of someone actually at the test. Some people have used cameras, and that includes video recording the person actually taking the test. You're talking about a pretty expensive process, though, for most organizations, and unless if you test, the good news is if you test a lot of people, then it makes sense to invest in that equipment, but if you test a lot of people, you need a lot of equipment, which makes it really expensive. Other people have used some innovative techniques. One is keystrokes, and you're asked to type 15 letters, a sequence of 15 letters 3 times, and each of us has an individual rhythm in our typing, regardless of whether we touch type or hunt and peck, and so that you can determine through how you type whether this is the same person taking the test throughout. Periodically, the test will stop in the middle and say, type those 15 letters, and you have to type them again. And so if I have a substitute, my substitute may not type at the same rate that I typed. Other people look for things like inactivity. If there's a pause between responding, maybe I'm turning around to this person who can't be seen by the camera to say, how do you work this problem, or what's the right answer here? Prohibited keys, the use of prohibited keys like print screens or escape, something like that, can be a signal to the test administrator, who may be monitoring remotely that someone is doing something nefarious and that that test needs to be halted. Many people recommend verification testing, where you give the test in an unproctored environment and then you follow up with a test in a proctored environment, and if those test scores are different enough, you invalidate the unproctored test score, or you at least question the person about what was going on and why would these scores be different. Interestingly, though it's a recommendation, I think the ITC actually recommends verification testing. It's not often used in the U.S., and I'm not sure why. I think people are simply willing to take their chances on the unproctored score, even though it might be compromised in some way. Lots of people use alternate forms, and increasingly with technology we are able to do research that would have been impossible only a few years ago simply because of the data computation. Lots of people use LOFT, which is linear on-the-fly testing, and it is composing different forms of a test with similar psychometric characteristics on the fly. So each person, everyone in this room, would have a separate test but with the same psychometric qualities, because we were able to pull from an item bank all of this information. Computer adaptive testing is another version of that. You typically have fewer items because you can really estimate the individual's theta or ability with fewer items. And other people have done some odd things. I'm not sure how well they work. Foster proposes using a serial presentation of responses. So you get the question, and then you get answer A, and you have to decide, is that right or wrong? If you say wrong, then you see B. If you say A is right, you never see B or C or D. I'm not sure how that works, but he's a big endorser of it. Other methods for preventing cheating including verbal statements that warn people about cheating. Lots of times people will say there are mechanisms in place to detect cheating, whether there are or not, and also say there are consequences to cheating, and those have been found to be somewhat effective. People have also used reminders. It's a little bit softer version of the reminder that if you cheat, you're going to be in trouble, to you are an honest and ethical person and you should follow the rules that we set. And finally, there are honesty contracts where you actually ask the individual to sign a statement that says, I promise that I am going to answer honestly and behave in an appropriate manner on this test. So a couple of important considerations that are related to cheating on unproctored testing I think we need to consider, particularly from a practice point of view. First of all, unproctored internet testing is probably here to stay. Our clients love technology, and they're not about to say, let's go back to the paper and pencil way and the proctored way because we're worried about cheating. They want people like me and you to figure out how can we solve this cheating problem. So number one is that proctoring is not the gold standard. And again, the warning is be careful when you look at the literature because most of the time you're comparing a lot of cheating to some cheating. It's not absolutely no cheating to cheating. It's degrees of cheating. Second of all, remember that cheating may not occur across the entire distribution of test scores. One hypothesis is that smart people don't cheat because they don't need to cheat. They look at the item, they know the answer, and they move on. They don't look for outside help, or they don't struggle to get pre-knowledge of the test. Another hypothesis is those are the people who do cheat because they're so close to the cutoff score, it is in their best interest. The people at the bottom of the distribution, there's no hope. Even with cheating, they're not likely to reach the cutoff score for your test. We don't know who cheats, and so we really can't say that smart people cheat or don't cheat, or the people who are less capable cheat or don't cheat. But I would not assume that cheating occurs at equal rates across the entire distribution of scores. Another consideration that I think is important to remember is that most tests have some practice effects. And so the practice effect itself may either enhance or minimize the appearance of cheating depending on the extent of the practice effect. There was a recent meta-analysis that found an effect size of 0.26 on measures of general mental ability, GMA. And then another consideration is that the motivation across different testing events changes. If you're taking an unproctored internet testing at home in front of your computer, you may not be very motivated, but if they call you in and say, we really think you're pretty good, come in and take this test, and we're going to watch you do it, that is a signal that there is some interest in you as a candidate. Another consideration is that individuals change over time, and that the time between the two tests could be as short as a day or as long as several years, and that the individual's physical and psychological well-being can change during that time, and even a person's ability can change slightly. Now, on basic skills, not so much, but if you're measuring things like job knowledge, yeah, that can change pretty much. There are typically fewer distractions in a proctored setting, which minimizes the extent of the cheating observed. So when you compare the unproctored condition with the proctored condition, you may see an increase in scores simply because the person is less distracted. The crying baby at home is not present in the proctored setting in the employment office. Proctored settings may have better quality equipment than the individual may have at home. Sometimes it's the reverse, but you're never sure. And then the threat of verification or the honesty warnings may be also a real deterrent to cheating. So, we typically don't worry about cheating on other forms of test. People can cheat on work samples and simulations, and I think that's important to remember. Oftentimes it's pre-knowledge of the materials. Let me show you how to do this work sample. They're going to ask you a question about an angry customer. Remember to say, I'm sorry you're having trouble. The pre-knowledge can help a lot, particularly if you're not very skilled in that area. Sometimes people can get outside assistance, particularly if the simulation is a low-fidelity one that is based on a video scenario, and then you've got some responses. There may be somebody behind you saying C is the right answer here. And then violation of time limits sometimes occurs. People are told, you have 30 minutes to solve this mechanical problem, and I'll be back, and the person's not back in 30 minutes, but you don't stop. You keep on going till they come back. So a few questions for practitioners. The first one is, how accurate is any one person's score? We can't tell if a person cheated or not. We don't know how accurate your score is. We also don't know whether it's better to prevent or detect cheating. We don't even know what our best deterrents are. We know we have things like CAT and LOFT and verification testing and warnings, but we don't know really which of these is best in any particular setting. We also don't know our best methods for detection. Again, they're proctors, both human and electronic, computer algorithms, self-report, lots of others that may be in the process of being developed, but we don't know whether it's better to prevent or detect, or whether we ought to be doing a little bit of both, and I suspect it's the latter. We also don't know how bad it is to hire someone who cheats on a test. How much of a performance decrement actually occurs if a person cheats? And that's an important question, because when we look at the relationship between a test score and a criterion measure, what we are doing is we are trying to predict those people who are most likely to be successful on the job. We also don't know how cheating on a test relates to other malfeasant behavior. If I cheat on a test, will I cheat on my expense account? Will I falsify company documents? We don't know the answer to those questions. We also have some moral or ethical questions. Is cheating on a cognitive ability test any worse than distorting responses on a personality inventory? And I suppose everyone, to some extent, puts his or her best foot forward on any sort of self-description. If I'm applying for a job, I'm unlikely to tell you about all the times that I messed up and did something wrong. I'm going to tell you about the positive aspects. So when you ask me to describe my personality, I'm going to think about my personality in positive terms and not talk about the times that I'm really not very functional as a human being or that I get very angry. Another question is the cost of cheating worth the benefits that come with expanding that applicant pool? And again, we don't really know. And then we don't know what can be done to prevent cheating in proctored settings. We need to spend some more time working on that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the testing environment and whether or not it matters. The testing environment is very much related to unproctored testing. Traditionally, people like me, I actually wrote a book chapter on what are good testing environments. And we just went, I remember writing a booklet for a client that was 25 pages long on how to set up the tables to make sure nobody can see the test and the signs you put on the door to keep people out. Unproctored testing, all of that goes out the window. We don't care. We do care, but we, the employer or the test provider, are saying that's up to the candidate to make those choices. But it does matter, I think, because it has an impact on the accuracy of the individual's test score. If I'm distracted when I'm taking a test, especially one that focuses on some aspect of cognitive ability, I will be challenged. I will be challenged to do well on that test. And if the accuracy of my test score is in question, then the validity and the reliability certainly are. There's also an impact on applicant reactions, and applicant reactions cut both ways. Some people are delighted that they can take the test where they want to take the test. They don't have to take time off from work to go into an employment office and take the test. And other people are horrified that they might be considering employment with a company that tolerates cheating. So what is the applicant reaction to unproctored testing? Are people okay with it? How do they feel about working side by side with someone who may have cheated to get that job? We don't know a lot definitively about test environment and its relationship to test performance or even test taker reactions. There is one study, the Weiner and Morrison study, that's cited here. Excuse me? And they compared proctored and unproctored testing on site to unproctored testing outside. And this is actually an error. The on-site unproctored test was rated the least favorable. So the applicants rated most favorably the on-site proctored and the off-site unproctored. A little bit of an anomaly there. The cognitive test scores were not related to ratings of environment, but the non-cognitive test scores were, which is an interesting finding. There's a lot of professional guidance on testing environment. In the U.S., we have two Bibles. One is called the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing, and that's published by the APA, the American Psychological Association, NCME, and then the Principles for the Use and Validation of Employee Selection Procedures, that's published by PSYOP, and that's the more practical employment-related testing. And I won't work, in the interest of time, I won't go through all the details here, but just be aware that in many countries there are very detailed ethical guidelines and standards that say this is what a good testing environment looks like. So I'm going to skip over these real quickly, and you all can read those at your leisure. And I'm just going to close with a few questions here for practitioners. The big one for me is, are our professional guidelines aligned with what we actually do in practice? And in some respects, I think the answer is no, they're not aligned. And so we've got to refine those standards that we use to guide good practice and good research with what's actually happening in the world today. The other question, I think, is who is responsible for ensuring a proper test environment? Should the employer be the parent? Should the employer be the one to say, I'm going to tell you how to take this test, how you will do well? And in today, I think that we're moving away from that perspective, and what we're saying is that if you take a test, this kind of environment is usually conducive to best test performance. So taking a test that requires scratch paper on a mobile telephone on a bus is probably not likely to produce your highest score. Rather than telling people you must come in and take this test, we're saying here's the environment that would work best for you. So, let me talk just quickly about the applicant pool and what impact unproctored internet testing has on it. Many people use UIT because they believe it expands their applicant pool. And in fact, most users of UIT cite huge increases in their applicant pool when they switch from a proctored test to an unproctored test. And the reason, of course, is that the test time is not limited to a specific place or specific time. I can take the test at 3 a.m. An important practice question, though, is the applicant pool expanding in desirable ways? We tend to find lots of people doing odd things. So, for example, some people are window shopping. They're not looking for a job. They're just looking to see what's out there, and they like to take a test to see what's on it. So they're just playing around. They're goofing off. And I may be a mother who's taking tests to see, can my son who's not too bright maybe pass this test. I may not be a serious test taker. Some people are going to lack the commitment to make any further efforts. They took the test online, but now I really do have to come in for an interview, and I'm not interested. And other people are practicing the test. I don't say, hi, I'm Nancy Tippins, and I'm going to take this test online. I say, I'm my friend Becky Boughton. I'm going to take the test. I'm going to get good at it. I'm going to learn what's on the test, practice, and then I'll come back and sign in as the real me. The question has been asked whether or not the applicant pool could shrink because of the practice of UIT. Some people don't want to work for the company that allows cheating, and then some people don't have access to computers or the internet. We talk a lot about the digital divide, and the digital divide relates to who has access to the internet and who doesn't. The Pew Research Center and American Family Life Project in the United States is the big researcher on technology. At this point, in May 2013, 91% of Americans owned a cell phone, 34% owned a tablet, 61 and 58% owned either a laptop or a desktop, respectively. The 2011 data from this is an ongoing study. In 2011, men and women were using the internet at about the same rate. Blacks and Hispanics used it a little bit lower than whites, and young people used it a lot more than older people. You all don't care about the U.S. predominantly, I'm sure. Here's some data on world internet usage, and here you see Europe is at 73.5% penetration for internet usage, which is quite high. And if we drill down even a little bit more, we see that Spain has an 82.2% penetration for internet usage by country. It's the number 19 in the line. Over 37 million users in Spain. This was 2016 data. And the total population is 46,000, so it's 82% penetration. That's a lot. Here it is by year. It's just interesting. What I found particularly interesting, I don't know what happened in Spain in 2003, but internet usage increased by 98.9%. You must have gotten a big internet services provider. Something odd happened in 2003. Many people are gravitating towards taking tests on smartphones and tablets. In the U.S., the ownership of both devices is increasing, and blacks and Hispanics, the minority population in the U.S., actually owns these at a higher rate than white people. The rate of ownership of tablets is about the same for all ethnic groups. Interestingly, tablets seem to be a tool of the more affluent. So it tends to be older people who have more disposable income and a little bit higher education. When we look at, I found this absolutely fascinating. When we look at mobile telephone penetration, in Spain you actually have more phones than people. There are 118 mobile phones for every 100 people in Spain, so there are plenty of phones to grow around. So getting back to the question of testing, does the composition of the applicant pool change with the use of technology-enhanced assessments? Again, we don't really know. There are not a lot of comparative studies. There's no reason to believe that the use of technology-enhanced assessments in an proctored environment has any effect. If you've got to come to the employment office, it doesn't matter whether there's technology there or not. We think that the size of the applicant pool with UIT does increase, but we don't know if the demographic composition changes or if the distribution of scores change. The higher rate of ownership of mobile phones by the minority groups certainly suggests that members of these groups have at least equal access, if not greater access. But the limitations of equipment and connectivity will limit who can take a test and who might complete a test without problems. So if there's a concern about targeting a particular group of people for employment, that needs to be taken into consideration. One last comment about the size of the applicant pool, cheating, and performance. There's an excellent study done by Landers and Sackett, and it was a simulation study of the effects of cheating relative to the increases in the size of the applicant pool. And they concluded that more cheating results in lower mean criterion scores. The more you cheat, the worse the job performance is likely to be, regardless of all the other factors. But if you increase the size of the applicant pool enough and keep your cutoff scores at the same level, at some point you actually are able to identify more qualified people despite the problem of cheating. So the questions that we leave for practitioners is, does the use of technology and assessment limit the accessibility for groups? It seems like that's less and less of an issue. You wonder about the people that don't own these devices and their ability to work in the modern world. That may be a little bit of a perspective based on my own privileged experience, but many jobs that are available today require the use of some form of technology. Most people have gotten over the idea that the familiarity with technology might have an effect. The research that's been done in that area suggests that most test administration platforms are so simple to use that everyone will be able to learn that. My own experience 20 years ago, we had big problems. We had people with using mouses as remote controls to the TVs, and the older people did not know how to use a mouse, but that seems to have diminished today too. Another concern, at least in the United States, is how technology affects the disabled, and we have hiring initiatives to hire people with qualified disabilities, and we need to think about whether or not technology embraces those and brings those people into the applicant pool. Vincente, is this time for a break? Yes, time for a break? 5 minutes, okay? I'll keep going. So, I want to pose the question of, should we use mobile testing? This is a big deal in the United States. Everybody wants to use mobile testing. But is it a good idea or is it not? Some HR professionals believe mobile testing is appropriate, some don't. Some of my colleagues at SHL do a study every year or two, and they ask HR people, what do you think about mobile testing? And they get data like these. 23% believe candidates want access to application forms and assessments via mobile devices. 43% would provide assessments via smartphone if that option existed. 41% indicated they would allow candidates to take assessments via smartphones if the research showed comparability of the test score from the mobile devices and those on computers. Interestingly, 23%, almost a quarter, though, said this is inappropriate. I wouldn't do it. When people are given the option of taking a test on a mobile device or on a computer, laptop, tablet, a very small percentage of people actually take the cognitive test on a mobile phone. It doesn't take much to look at the test and say, this is not the right device to do that. One study found 1% of applicants took a graduate level cognitive test using a mobile device, and 7% used it for non-cognitive assessment. In another study, 1.7% used the mobile device on a measure that consisted of both verbal and numerical ability and a 5-factor model. This study was able to demonstrate, though, that the people who took the test on the mobile device performed less well on the cognitive measures than those using a PC. No differences on the non-cognitive measure, which suggests that the people were actually taking the test seriously. It wasn't that the people taking it on the mobile device really didn't care. They were taking it seriously because there were no differences on the non-cognitive measures, but certainly the mobile device had an impact. And then here's one more study that said there were no differences on the non-cognitive test. There are lots of implications on the mobile devices, of the use of mobile devices. You know, the good news about mobile devices is that they are mobile. They can be easily transported. The implication is that the candidate can take the test any place he or she wants to, but there's an impact. They can take the test in less than ideal conditions. They can cheat in some environments. The applicant pool might expand, etc. Similarly, they require an internet connection, and the reliability and speed of internet connections in many countries, including the United States at least, varies from place to place. I go to many places where I have no internet connection. And again, that interrupted, the inaccessible test has an implication on the applicant pool. The interrupted test has an implication on persons' test scores and their ability to focus on the test. Importantly, the bandwidth for some tests may not be wide enough for streaming video or more complex kinds of stimulus for the test taking. Another characteristic is they have smaller screens, and it is really a challenge sometimes, I think, to manipulate on a small mobile screen and to do that quickly and accurately, and that certainly would have an impact on the test scores here. One of the cautions that I offer to you when you look at the literature on technology and particular mobile devices is that you never know exactly what kind of mobile device people are talking about. You don't know whether it's what we call a cell phone, and if it's a cell phone, how big is the screen on that cell phone? Is it a tablet? Is it a phablet? Is it a laptop? We probably know it's not a desktop computer, but is a laptop a mobile device or is it a computer? My laptop's a pretty big laptop. I'd put it more in the computer category, but other people, their laptop may be more like a tablet. So be very careful when you look at this continuum. There's been some interesting research lately about why the equipment that you use affects your test score. And it basically deals with the screen size, the interface, and the permissibility of what you're able to do, and the impact it has on the cognitive demands of the test taker, both in terms of the individual's working memory, their ability to information process, their psychomotor ability, and the distractibility or the selective attention. So when you are doing something on a small mobile device, it may challenge your psychomotor ability, it may challenge your working memory because you have to scroll up and down, you can't see all of it at the same time. It may require more information processing than if you saw the entire item on a larger screen. Last year there was some interesting work done by O'Connell and his colleagues at Select International, and they reviewed all of the papers that were in the literature on mobile testing. Only 3 of the 11 papers they found were peer-reviewed, so we have some pause there. Most of these studies were based on operational data with very, very large sample sizes. Fewer than 5% in these studies used mobile devices, and they made no distinction between smartphones and tablets. Both devices were the same. They did find that the minority groups used the mobile devices more often, and there were a whole range of methods that were used, ranging from the Likert type items, biodata, multiple choice, multimedia simulations. None of the articles expressed much concern about measurement equivalency for either the cognitive test or the non-cognitive test, and that will be another one of my concerns in just a minute, is that equivalency is an issue and a concern. They didn't find, in general, mean score differences on non-cognitive constructs, but the limited research found substantial mean differences when they studied cognitive tests. Looking at group means, which again is an issue particularly important in the U.S., they were not any larger with mobile devices. In fact, in many studies they seem to be smaller, which was a good thing, and other people have supported that finding. There is a belief that mobile devices will exacerbate the subgroup differences if historically lower performing minority groups have a disproportionately and substantially higher use of the mobile device itself. So if you increase the number of people who are likely to perform who are likely to perform poorly on the test, you'll see larger subgroup differences. So the conclusions that these people reached was that smartphones do produce different scores because they are the most extreme in the critical characteristics of the device: the small screen, the challenging interface, and the widest permissibility, including the most unsuitable conditions. And collectively, those 3 things engendered the highest cognitive load and demands on the test taker. There was some evidence that subgroup differences could be reduced by modifying the application that was actually used, but these authors felt the difference was unlikely to be eliminated completely. And they also concluded that subgroup differences were likely to be confounded by the problem of increasing the number of minority groups who use that device. So the question remains, should we assess individuals on mobile devices, and do the advantages outweigh the disadvantages? From an employer's perspective, that's a really tough question. Part of me wants to say, let them do what they want to do, give them the option, give them the warning. The other part of me says we are looking for capable people, and we need to do everything we can to identify those people. So, pardon? Stop now? Okay. We're going to take a break. Oftentimes people assume that a test given on a mobile device or in an unproctored setting is just the same as a score that is achieved on a computer, and there's some evidence that that may not be true. If we look at SJI, situational judgment inventories, there seems to be a moderate degree of cross-mode equivalence between the scores, according to Petotsky and Bobko. But if you look at other studies, the variance and covariance matrices are not equivalent. One of the problems in equivalency studies is that there are lots of different ways to calculate equivalence, and so sometimes you'll find that some authors say the tests are equivalent and other authors say they aren't, and it's really a function of what statistics were used to calculate it. There's some evidence that biodata, there's some evidence that biodata is not equivalent from one study. Again, there's not a lot of evidence to conclusively say that they are or not, depending on the modality in which the test is administered. Looking at personality tests, we've got lots of different studies that have very conflicting information. The Ployhart study says the variance and covariance matrices are not equivalent between the two for measures of conscientiousness, agreeableness, and emotional stability. The Mead study found comparability on all test scores, including conscientiousness, which would be in direct contrast to the Ployhart study. Interestingly, in this study, they found that there was a lack of measurement invariance when the person taking the test had the opportunity to choose the medium in which the test was administered compared to those who had a choice. So being able to choose has an impact on the equivalency of the scores and likely reflects the comfort of the test taker with the different modalities. Chua and his colleagues found equivalence between paper and pencil and internet measures and unproctored on personality. And then the Salgado study also found equivalence of scores based on the Big Five personality measures. When we get to cognitive abilities, there is definitely some disagreement here. The Mead studies found equivalence on computer-administered tests for power cognitive tests, but when the test was speeded, there was no equivalence. And they found no differences between adaptive and conventional tests. Petotsky, again, found modest degree of cross-mode equivalence between scores from paper and pencil tests and internet cognitive ability tests when they were timed. So I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts on score equivalency. Many organizations infer equivalency by comparing the means and the standard deviations. So if we give a test to one group under one condition and give the test to another group under another condition and the means are similar, we say, well, the tests are equivalent. But that is not what psychometrically really constitutes measurement equivalence. Sample sizes are often a huge problem. It takes fairly large samples to do most of the statistics that underlie equivalent studies. And the other problem that I think is particularly salient to people in industry is the problem of establishing equivalence not only between devices but also across cultures. So many times we want to develop a test that's used internationally, and we have the problem of different devices, but we also have different languages and also different cultures. And the sample size requirements when you have device by culture becomes huge. Very few studies have compared high-fidelity simulations to paper and pencil tests. Most people aren't doing paper and pencil high-fidelity simulations. It kind of doesn't make sense. The implicit assumption, though, is that there are some differences, that in one case the demand on the test taker is to perform in a certain way. In the other, it is to describe what you might do. So there are some complete differences. The Chan and Schmidt study that's sort of old now, the 1997 study, compared a written and a video SJI, and it wasn't really intended to be an SJI study, but they did attribute different candidate reactions to the reading comprehension demand in the paper and pencil test. So there was much, the test taker was really being asked to do something quite different in the written test. A couple of questions for practitioners. One is, how do we conduct equivalent studies on small samples? Is it okay for us to simply say our statistics can't handle it, therefore we're not going to do it? Or do we need to be searching for better ways to establish the similarity of the test scores and their meanings? And if so, how would we go about doing that? And then the second question is related to what I just spoke about, and that is conducting equivalency studies that take into account the device as well as the culture, and there may be other differences that also need to be taken into account. So let's talk a minute about candidate reactions to technology-enhanced assessments. There is a lot of research. I shouldn't say research, there are a lot of publications that hypothesize that candidate reactions have an impact on behavioral outcomes that include things like job offers, acceptance, consumption of the organization's products and services, the probability of a challenge, of a selection procedure. All of those kinds of things are assumed to be an outcome of a negative reaction. But in truth, we don't have very good data, and the research does not confirm that there is a relationship between how I feel about the test and what my behavior is likely to be. So I might do badly on a test, think it's silly, ridiculous, get a job offer and accept it, no problem. Similarly, I might do quite well on a test, think it's pretty good, but I may choose to go someplace else. I'm smart and I have lots of other opportunities. There have been several studies, though, that have confirmed this total lack of relationship. So why is this? Well, probably it starts with too few studies being done in this area and too few outcomes actually being considered. We also tend to use global measures of candidate reaction. So we say, how do you like the test? We didn't say, how about the content? How about the response process? How about the device on which it was measured? How about the interface? We're not decomposing the whole test experience so that we can gauge what applicants like and dislike about the test. I love the quote in Sackett and Levin's annual review article a couple of years ago that said that the lack of evidence for the relationship between candidate reactions and the individual or organizational outcomes was the Achilles heel of our field, and I really do have to agree with that. What limited research we have does suggest that candidate reactions are highly dependent on the type of technology-enhanced assessments. Almost universally, candidates for pre-employment or promotions like simulations and work samples. They tend to generate much more favorable reactions. People feel like it's an opportunity for them to display, this is what I know how to do, let me show you what I can do, rather than have to answer some questions about what they know. On the mobile testing research, there's not a lot reporting applicant reactions. There were 2 of the 11 studies did report it. One, the Gutierrez and Meyer, found that mobile testing is perceived as less fair, more difficult, less comfortable, and makes an individual no more likely to apply. But that doesn't necessarily, it does not indicate employer provides a better place to work, and applicants show a preference for using a PC or a personal computer. The Smeltzer study had similar kinds of results when the applicants reported that the mobile testing approach interfered with the opportunity to perform on the test, did not improve perceptions of the organization, and did not think that the organization would view taking tests on mobile devices negatively or affect hiring decisions, and they also showed a preference for the personal computer. There was one study that I dug up in one of my reviews of the literature that said continuous monitoring via technology is perceived as very invasive and threatening to privacy. This would be something like having a camera watch you while you take a test or record you as you take a test. Candidates didn't like that at all. There were some implications in the study that they might prefer more of a one-time check, such as biometric identification, like checking your retina to make sure you are who you say you are, your fingerprints. For me, the questions about, as a practitioner, are really is what is the appropriate methodology for evaluating applicant reactions? And I want to highlight the great need for us understanding what people in the applicant pool feel about these kinds of tests and what impact it has in their willingness to apply for a job and then to accept that job if they're qualified. Again, we really need to separate the reactions to the technology that's used to deliver the test from the actual content of the test. One of the topics that arises frequently in our country is the advantages and the disadvantages of technology-enhanced assessments. They've been discussed at length, and again, there's not a lot of research on this topic. What's interesting to me is that some of the advantages are also disadvantages, and some of the things that we call advantages and disadvantages we really don't know a lot about, so it's a very confusing topic in my mind. I've tried to sort these out into what I think are advantages and disadvantages and what are some of the open issues. To me, cost is both an advantage and a disadvantage as well as an unknown. And as we like to say as psychologists, it depends. It depends on all kinds of things, but it's important to understand what are the sources of those costs and how do they impact the bottom line of your testing budget. Most people would look at cost and say, well, obviously there's a reduction in test administrators' printing cost. At the same time, even if you have unproctored testing and you're asking applicants to test on their own devices, you still have to have the software that runs these testing programs, the databases that store the results, et cetera. And what we really don't know is how much does the equipment to run those things cost? What about the people who manage this equipment? You know, most big testing publishers today employ hundreds of IT people. There are more IT people in many companies than there are psychologists developing the tests. The IT people are there making sure that everything's running okay. A real advantage to any sort of computerized test is the ease of updating. In the dark ages, when I started out, if you had an error in a test, you had to reprint all the test booklets, which was time-consuming and expensive. But the real problem came in when you distributed these tests to 500 employment offices across the United States, is how do you get them to quit using the wrong booklet and use the right booklet? And it was very, very challenging to get people straight on what is the current version of the test. We've talked a little bit already about the location of the test and the perceived inconvenience to the applicants and the potential expansion of the applicant pool. Certainly applicant reactions with respect to simulations and games is a positive. It may be a negative with computer adaptive testing and applicant reactions in some other areas we simply don't know. UIT is one of them. We don't really know what highly qualified applicants think about UIT in various levels of jobs in various industries. Certainly speed in processing has got to be an advantage. You are able to generate a score very quickly in many of these assessments, but not all. If you're doing simulations that are based on video and you still have a human assessor, that person has got to make those ratings, and that may take longer. There's a lot of talk now with respect to the interface between selection and recruitment and how selection supports the employment brand of the employer. And many people perceive that technology-enhanced assessments help the employer present itself as a company that is on the leading edge of technology and is embracing new things and new ideas, which is very appealing to a large segment of the applicant pool, particularly those who are at the younger end of the age distribution. In a lot of cases, the advantages also include realistic job previews, or RJPs, we call them. The test itself, in the case of a situational judgment inventory or high-fidelity simulation, can be a very good, realistic presentation of this is what you're going to do on the job. This is what it's like. Yes, you're going to talk to an angry customer. Yes, you're going to talk to a customer who may not have anything better to do than to talk to you on the telephone. And how do you manage those kinds of people? The disadvantages are well known. We've talked about the cost a little bit. There's the potential for cheating and other forms of malfeasance. Many employers or test publishers spend huge amounts of money developing these tests, and one compromise can ruin the test completely. I do a lot of work for police and fire departments, and I work for one of the largest police departments in the United States, and I presume the world, and one test gets out, and that test cannot be used because of the importance of this job. Police officers are so vital, and the potential of cheating, so we just throw it away and start over, but it's hundreds of thousands of dollars wasted. We've talked about test distractions, applicant reactions. Privacy concerns are growing in many places, that when I take a test and I have to provide an ID, do I give my social security number, which is the employer, which is the federal number that gears all of our federal benefits? People aren't willing to share that much anymore. Do I want to share to some unknown entity my personality quirks or my knowledge deficits? Maybe or maybe not. A disadvantage too with some test and is the candidate engagement. With some of these tests, the items come so fast it's hard to engage them. In others, I would argue that engagement probably belongs in the advantage column. If you're talking about gamification, which is a hot topic now, or some of the simulations, clients are highly engaged. And then there are lots of things that we don't know, and I've mentioned most of these: the applicant pool, the diversity of that applicant pool, the extent to which you can make accommodations for the disabled. In the U.S. ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which requires us to accommodate people with qualified disabilities. Can you make an accommodation to certain kinds of tests? If it's a speeded, unproctored test, how do you do that? What are the mechanics of actually doing that? The equivalence of scores we've talked about, we don't know, and then the effects of subgroup differences or adverse impact. I wanted to drill down just a little bit into the cost issue, just because I think it's so important when you are actually using tests in business. You really do have to understand your costs so that you can make a business case for why this test is useful in the organization. There are lots of sources of costs. There's the cost of developing the test. Part of it is psychological assistance. Who are the people who are writing items, doing the research, doing the psychometric analyses? But there's also IT support, and in some of these tests there are actors and videographers. The list goes on, but there are multiple sources of cost, and you need to identify all of them. Once that test is developed, there's a lot of maintenance, and it's not just wrong items, it is items that change with the times. In the United States, our laws change, and we have so many laws related to discrimination against certain protected groups that we often have to go in and remove items or replace items because they refer to something that is not legal. I once had a test that had an item in it that said, I like to stand in front of people and give speeches. Well, it turns out that became a disability problem because not everyone can stand. The item seemed good, but it was a problematic, so we had to rewrite that item, replace that item.
There's certainly maintenance on the software. Technology changes so rapidly that what worked 5 years ago may not work on today's computers or tablets or mobile phones. Administration can be a huge source of cost depending on how the test is administered. Some of the most expensive ones are these videographic presentations of items that still require human resources to evaluate. I've seen some people who actually record the candidates' responses so that the assessor has to watch it twice. They watch it live, and then they watch it a second time. And that's a huge time demand if the assessment lasts for very long. There's certainly cost to scoring and reporting, and then there are per applicant costs for various kinds of computer usage that increase with the number of applicants. So when you have unproctored internet testing and expand your applicant pool exponentially, those per candidate fees will rise, particularly if you're an employer who is paying a testing vendor per test. It can get quite high. Like cost, very few people report the benefits of their use of the technology in very precise terms. The one exception I found is the casino article that I'll talk a little bit more about. They didn't report their cost or include their estimates of SDY that we use in utility analysis, but they did share the utility estimates, and their average utility for a video-based assessment tool using only significant validities was $109 million, which is a lot of money. It's really quite unbelievable, and personally I think that that's one of the downfalls to the process that we use in the U.S. to calculate utility, which is the Schmidt and Hunter process. That's an unbelievable number, and people really don't take it too seriously. Like cost, there are a number of sources of benefits that are both tangible and intangible. There are the reduced cost of administration for things like UIT. There's the benefits of the increased applicant pool. There may be a better applicant pool. We've not proved that yet, but there are certainly people who believe that by allowing people to take a test at any time, we get more people who are better qualified. People who are employed are more reluctant to take time off from the job and go take a test, and so you may get those people who are employed rather than just the people who are chronically unemployed. Certainly there's more efficient and timely use of staffing, that you're able to staff jobs more quickly and more efficiently with many of these approaches. And there are positive reactions to many of these different approaches, including the high-fidelity simulations. You also, as a psychologist, psychometrist, are able to collect a lot more data about the testing experience. So lots of people now are experimenting with response time, and what does it mean when you answer an item quickly as opposed to slowly? Is there information in that? And then I mentioned earlier that there's the benefit of company image. A couple of final thoughts about the cost-benefit ratios. I think we can conclude safely that most organizations do not have a firm idea of the cost of the value of and the benefits of their testing program. Even the tangible costs and benefits are difficult to administer. The intangible ones are virtually impossible to calculate. What I find interesting is that the importance of cost in business decisions is not really known. We don't know how business leaders evaluate testing programs, and cost seems to be a factor, but not the only factor people make in deciding whether or not to use a test or to use a particular kind of test. We also know that different factors seem to have different weights for different organizations. So some companies put a lot more value on the image that they present to the applicant pool, or even on the acquisition of high-quality candidates than they do on the actual cost of the testing program. So Questions for practitioners, they include how important is the cost relative to the goals of the assessment program, and what are the benefits that offset those costs. We really need to think hard about that. And then I think we have to question how much effort do you need to put into quantifying these kinds of things when we're not even sure how they're used. Maybe it's irrelevant. Maybe we need to just point out, here are the categories, what do you think they are, and let business leaders make their decisions. And then if it's important to make that business case, what is the appropriate process, and what's going to be most persuasive to the people who are making the decision in the organization? What factors need to be included? I want to finish up this section of my talk with a little bit of a discussion about ethics and unproctored internet testing. And again, I'm not going to go into all these slides because they may not be relevant to you, but I will point out that most countries have ethics codes that we need to abide by. And the ethics codes in general talk about our obligation to use tests in a responsible manner. And they say things like we need to use tests that are appropriate in light of the research or evidence of their usefulness and proper application. And when I read things like this, I always get concerned about the number of open questions I have. Things like questions about equivalence or the questions about the relative validity of a test. And I think that as professionals, we really have to stop and think, what are the ethics of what we are doing, and are we consistent with the ethical codes under which we practice? Skipping over to the questions that we have, when I think about technology-enhanced assessments, a couple of ethical problems occur to me. And I have to ask myself, do we have an ethical problem? And I think not. If I did, I'd have to say, stop, I'm not going to do this anymore. So I think I'm okay with this, but I think it's also important to continue the discussion about ethics and make sure that we're on the right side of morality here. One of the questions that we ask in the United States a lot is, are we obligated to use the most valid test? And I argue that we're not, that you use it. The choice of a test depends on many things, including the goals of the organization. And while accuracy and prediction may be very important, there are other things to consider. It may be cost. It may be the organization's image. We are not necessarily obligated to use the most valid test. We are obligated to use a valid test, but not necessarily the most valid. Similarly, I think we have to ask ourselves, are we obligated to use the most reliable test? This comes into play when we start talking about unproctored internet testing. If we are unsure about the reliability of an individual's test score, should we be using it? And in the end, I think we're probably okay there, but that's certainly a controversial topic. We've talked a little bit about this already, and that's our responsibility for ensuring appropriate test environment and helping applicants to do their best on an assessment. I do think that we have an obligation to inform test takers about the conditions under which they are likely to achieve their best scores, but to actually provide it. I think the train has left the station on the question of unproctored internet testing, and that there's no going back, and that we are going to have to deal with that by informing test candidates of what best practices would be related to test taking. The other set of ethical questions that concern me are the inferences we make about test scores and validity, and are they accurate? Are we saying the right things? And I think it depends on what you did and what you say about what you did. If you validate a test under proctored conditions using a paper and pencil test, and you are now going to use it in an unproctored environment, and you've switched from a computer to a mobile phone, the inference of validity and reliability is questionable. Certainly the inference of equivalence is questionable. So being precise about what you say is mandatory. And again, I'm not sure I would ever use a test when I change the conditions so radically. I would need to have a little bit more evidence of the validity of the test under the same conditions. And then I think another ethical question that a lot of us aren't quite sure where to go on, and that is, are we appropriately protecting an applicant's privacy? And this issue is coming up more and more with respect to big data. Many organizations are collecting data about individuals and using it throughout the employee's career. So a test you took for an entry-level position may be a piece of information that's used for a later decision in the organization. And is that okay? Is that appropriate use of those test data, particularly if the candidate was never informed? So my last topic is, what else can I worry about? I am a worrier. There are lots of things to worry about, and I could have talked for 4 days about all of my worries, but I wanted to highlight just a few. These are new emerging technologies, and I just want to mention them because I think they are things that deserve our attention. Gamification is a big deal. Lots of people are talking about it, and no one is doing any good research. Gamification typically refers to some sort of engaging simulation in which the test candidate performs certain tasks and may do those interactively with other people. The question I have is, how are these things scored? You know, is it who gets the castle first, or who blows up the enemy, or whatever this game is about? How do you score it? And how do you take into account the effects of other people playing the same game? If I'm playing the game with someone who's not too bright, I may do quite well. And if I'm playing a game with someone who's very bright, I may not do so well. So how do you take that into account? How do you measure that? And then, how can you possibly calculate the validity of this game unless you have scored it in some way? So there's lots that needs to be teased out. My sense is that this may be a little bit of a passing fad, that people think it's a really fun thing to do because lots of young people play games on the internet. Whether or not it's an appropriate technique for employee selection, I'm not sure. Lots of people are tending to branching tests. They're particularly used in job knowledge tests, where you make one decision and then based on that decision you have to make another decision. So they're used in medical exams a lot. So you say, well, the first thing I would do is take the patient's temperature, and that is a scorable item. And then that test, the test administration program comes back and says, the patient's temperature is 98.6 Fahrenheit. Now what do you do? And so based on what you ask and what information you get back, you ultimately get to a diagnosis of the patient. Well, how do you score that? Is it based on the order of the items? Is it based on the ultimate conclusion that you get? Is there any need for efficiency? How would that efficiency be evaluated? We need to really think about how these tests are used. They can be very useful and very realistic, but it's not clear to me how we actually use them in practice. Big data is a big deal. I think I said earlier that lots of people are mining the information about individuals on the internet for information that might be used to predict future job behavior. It might be from social media like Facebook. It might be credit ratings that are available sometimes in our country. It might be information that you provide in an application blank. Today, most of the work that I've seen is totally atheoretical, meaning there's no rhyme or reason as to why the data element predicts, but it does, so it's used. I recently read a study where someone used the number of jobs a person had was related to future job performance negatively, inversely. So the more jobs you had, the worse your job performance was. It's not clear why that would be true. there might be some underlying hypotheses like, well, you had a lot of jobs because you didn't perform very well and you had to keep leaving jobs, but that's really not apparent. In my country, it is essential that you be able to demonstrate the job relevancy of every predictor. As I said earlier, it is unlawful to use a selection tool that is not job relevant. You simply can't do it. You're in deep trouble, so it's important that we be able to establish this. And then I think there's the question of big data raising ethical and privacy concerns. Another technology that will keep you awake at night if you think too much about it is brain imaging. This is using brain imaging techniques, MRIs, to measure a person's brain. Oftentimes it's done when a person is assigned a particular task and you see how their brain lights up, indicating whether they like doing it or not like doing it, or how hard they have to work to solve the problem. And it raises all kinds of ethical questions in my mind, as well as privacy concerns. And we really don't know much about its validity. It's not well used. We don't know how applicants react to it. And I think we have to ask ourselves, how would that work in an employment office? Would you say, please step into my MRI machine, to someone dressed in a business suit carrying a briefcase? Would that be appropriate? And I kind of think not. Another concern that's related to technology is dynamic norms, and lots of organizations now offer these so that you provide normative information about so that you can relate a test score to the appropriate normative group. And they are done by, typically done by country and by function. So you can have executive, manager, supervisor, engineer, salesperson, whatever. And then you have different countries. And the problem with this is it sounds well and good, but we often don't know how good the data underlying those norms are. So we don't know whether the normative database for that group is based on 10 people or 10,000 people, and I think that makes a real difference. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to move to a quick discussion of some case studies that I brought along just to give you a flavor of what some people are doing. And I've got a challenge. There we go. Thank you.
20 minutes.
20?
No more than 20, okay?
Okay, so I'm going to go through these at a pretty high level, and I'm going to focus on three. I want to talk about a verbal and numeric test that's used in a loft scenario, a general ability screen, using a computer adaptive technology framework. And then if I have enough time, I'll hit the video-based testing so that you'll have a flavor of different approaches. So the verbal and numerical test is, oh, sorry, I wanted to make sure I identified my acronyms. So UIT is unproctored internet testing, and CAT is a computer adaptive test. In the UIT, the test is administered over the internet in location and conditions of the candidate's choosing. Computer adaptive test, the item characteristics are defined using IRT, item response theory, and they're aggregated to identify the ability level of the candidate. So in this first group, some sample items for the verbal and the numeric. And I want to be clear, this is not computer adaptive. These are high level. This test has different functional levels, but I can't read this, so I don't really know what it says, but you all can read it. These are basically situations that you're presented, and you have to say whether or not it's true or false, or you don't have enough information to do this. Here's another example. And then here's an example of, this is an example of numerical reasoning. Sorry. Some of these are graphical, like this one, and some of these are simply charts. And again, you have to look at the item or look at the material in the chart or the graph and then answer a question about the meaning of the information in there. And then there are inductive reasoning tests that are nonverbal, and you have to look at the pattern and determine what's the next in the sequence. So the linear on-the-fly versions of these tests, remember these are tests that are pulled from a bank of items, and each test has the same psychometric characteristics. Each of these tests are defined to have a specific number of items, and you are given a specific amount of time to take these tests. Okay. So just to give you an idea of the construction of these items, item characteristics for this test were determined using a 2-parameter IRT model from over 16,000 participants. One of the things that we often do is look at different numbers of parameters in the IRT model, and 2 seems to fit most often. Occasionally we'll have a 1-parameter model and occasionally a 3, but usually it's the 2-parameter model. Just to refresh your memory, for those of you all who aren't down in the weeds in the IRT business, the theta parameter is the level of ability and difficulty of the items. The B parameter reflects the point on the theta scale where the probability of getting the item correct is 50% and usually reflects the difficulty of the item. The A parameter is the slope of the item characteristic curve and reflects the discrimination ability of the item itself. Once these items go through this process, they're screened on a number of factors, especially a sensitivity. Does it give offense to any group of people? Does it have a low A parameter, meaning it doesn't discriminate well? Is it extreme on the B parameter, meaning less than 3 or greater than 3, so it's either a very hard item or a very difficult item? Items that take a long time to complete are usually eliminated because they take a disproportionate amount of time. And then we look for distractors with positive item total correlations. The scoring of the computer adaptive test, we estimate the theta on an initial set of items for which the A and B parameters are known, and using the initial theta estimates and item properties, we calculate the expected probability of getting the item correct. Then we calculate the difference between the candidate answering correctly and the expected probability of the candidate getting the item correct. We sum those differences, standardized differences, and add the standard difference to the initial theta estimate, and we repeat that cycle until the value of the initial value of theta and the new theta are trivial. In plain English, what we're really doing is we are administering people an item, and based on how they respond, we give them a more difficult item or less difficult item. If they get the more difficult item wrong, we give them an easier item. If they get the less difficult item correct, we give them a harder item, and we bracket the original theta until we get an estimate that is accurately reflecting their ability. So when we look at these verbal and numerical tests, the score we look at reliability, and this is controversial. Not everyone agrees that reliability can be looked at for these kinds of tests in this way. So here are the numbers. I'm going to give you another study in just a second that these researchers said, no, you can't really correct that, cannot calculate the reliability. So the difference in score accuracy is that in classic testing theory, CTT, the accuracy of a score is believed to be accurate across all levels of scores, that your test score is accurate regardless of what you do. In IRT, the score accuracy depends on the properties of the questions included and the range of the thetas. When you talk about variations across forms, this is where it really gets controversial. But both approaches would take an alternate forms coefficient. In this study, there were 100 forms pulled and people tested, and the reliabilities were quite robust, 81 for verbal, 0.83 for numeric, a little bit lower on the verbal for supervisors and operators, and a little bit higher on numeric for supervisors and operators. Test-retest validity, again, is a little bit controversial, but 0.72 and 0.70 is not bad. Looking at the meta-analytic criterion-related validities, the range of observed validities is 0.21 to 0.43 for verbal and 0.11 to 0.34 for numerical, and corrected, they're 0.50 and 0.39 respectively, which are quite good. Of course, I don't think anybody would see those operationally. That has a lot of corrections in it. Some work has been done on the construct validity of these kinds of tests. Just to be clear, the numbers above the diagonal are the uncorrected validities, and below are the corrected validities. So you see that the relationship between this verbal and numerical test are related to what you would expect them to be related to, measures of general mental ability, Ravens, progressive matrices, verify inductive reasoning. So there was good evidence for construct validity here. One of the questions that arises with these kinds of tests, if they're given in an unproctored setting, is what do you do when the verification test score is flagged? In the verification scenario, you give one test in the unproctored setting and a second test in a proctored setting. So, and there's an algorithm that's used to say this difference is big enough that we're concerned. And I wanted to point these out because I think in practice, you know, the idea of saying to a person, well, you must have cheated, so we're not going to hire you, sounds good when you're in a research lab. It doesn't sound so good when you're in an employment office face-to-face with an individual. So what you need to do is just to really think, how am I going to approach this individual, taking into account that there are reasons why a verification score might be substantially higher than the original test score. And so we recommend that there be questions asked like, what was the candidate's physical conditions? Is there any obvious reason why that person might have not felt well on the date of the original test but now feels just fine? How are those different, and how should that be taken into account? Were there reasons why the candidate was unable to focus while taking the verification test? Were there distractions that might have happened in one of the test or the other? And were there physical or psychological reasons why the candidate didn't focus very well? Looking at what the person did on each test, how many of the items did they complete in the verification test? Maybe they got frustrated and just gave up. Maybe they ran out of time. Did the candidate attempt the practice items? Sometimes we find that people make assumptions about tests and they're really not prepared to take the test that they're offered. And then sometimes simply asking the candidate, why do you think you did so differently on these two tests? In the end, though, it all comes down to a subjective judgment and a policy of the organization who is using the test to determine, am I going to accept this person's original score, or am I going to discard the candidate and say he or she is not qualified? So I think there are a couple of discussion questions that I'll leave you with to think about. And one is, what is the appropriate criteria for evaluating the differences between a test and a verification test? And at what point is a test score disqualified, and then what should I do about it? And then thinking about what are the advantages of LOFT compared to computer adaptive testing is a really important question in my mind. Both are challenging to do operationally, especially with the test administration program. So which is better? Is it better to have everyone taking a test with the same psychometric characteristics, or is it better to try to pinpoint the individual's actual ability level? My response to that, just so you know, is that it depends on what you want to know. If you want to know, does a person have the qualifications necessary to perform this job as defined in this way, LOFT works pretty good. If you're trying to evaluate the individual and see what the range of abilities might be across the entire applicant pool, then adaptive testing makes a lot more sense. Here's another example of a general ability screen, and this was a screen intended to identify unqualified entry-level candidates and to make sure they had enough cognitive ability to do this basic job. Items were pulled from the item banks for numerical ability, inductive reasoning, verbal ability, and deductive reasoning, with lots of different item types. The test was intended to be very short because it was a screen, pushed a lot of people through the process. So there are 12 questions, 10 minutes, had to be globally adaptable, so certain kinds of items really don't work too well. Analogies may be a particularly American kind of item, but it's items where you compare the meaning of words and you say puppy is to dog as kitten is to blank, and you have to fill in the blank. Those are great, except when you start using words that are much more complex and have multiple meanings, they are highly difficult to translate. So one of the requirements here was that they be globally adaptable. The range of difficulty was constrained to be no more, to be between minus 2.0 and 0. The discrimination factor was set at greater than 1. And guessing was taken care of, given the shortness of the time limit and the number of items, to be less than 0.25 for deductive, inductive, and quantitative items, and less than 0.30 for verbal items. The 12 items, 10 minutes was selected because 80% of the population on which this test was developed could complete those items, and oftentimes that's the definition we use for a power test. And the reliability was estimated to be 0.87. This is the group that really said, no, let's not calculate alternate forms reliability or test-retest reliability. Several different criteria that were related to performance, key performance indicators, or global ratings about would you rehire this person. And here are the results of this kind of test. The observed correlations are moderate, but they are certainly, I think, substantial when you look at the cognitive composite criterion measure. And when you look at the operational versions, they go up to 0.24, which is quite nice in my book. We're lucky to have those sometimes. Subgroup differences, because these are relevant to us, again, they are quite limited. Certainly not a problem with females, some problem with age, probably related to the speed of processing. The African Americans and Hispanics did have a little bit of trouble here, as well as the American Indians and the Native Hawaiians, which is surprising. So the discussion questions here are how much speed is needed to reduce cheating significantly. If the test had been 8 minutes, would that have reduced cheating? We don't know how much cheating actually occurred here, and we don't really know what the incremental validity of more in-depth test over the short screening test is. The third case study that I have is on technology-enabled assessments, and I'm not going to go into any detail with this one. I've described here the process that was used to develop it. This test is a video-based scenario. The videos are taped. The development steps are listed here in case you're interested, as well as the administration process. They do use 2 raters to score this, but what I wanted to skip to was some of the validities and the benefits. So here you see that the validities against cognitive tests, they did an unusual thing. They used t-test, and they're comparing the differences between scores on the VBT and the scores on the particular test, which in my mind is not really indicative of validity, but nevertheless it's what they used. But they showed a great deal of similarity between the measures that should be similar. But here's what I wanted to get to. They did look at the cost. They figured it was $59 to administer and score this. Not sure how they got there, but that was half of the cost of the $137 that had been used for a structured interview beforehand. They actually listed the sources of the development cost as well as the sources of the implementation, which I think is informative to other people who want to implement such a instrument in their organizations. They also had applicants rate different things, including their performance, their comfort, the sufficiency of the instructions, and the 45-second response time at the end of each of these scenarios that was presented. And if you have it in front of you, the responses are really quite favorable. So, the discussion questions here, I think, are how does the validity of the VBT compare to a more abstract test, such as a measure of cognitive ability? Is it substantially more valid, or is it less valid? And if it is less valid, are the benefits to using a VBT, the realistic job preview, the employment brand, those kinds of things, worth the cost of doing this? Maintaining a test like a VBT is a challenge. How do you keep that up to date at a reasonable cost? Is there any evidence of cheating here? And then what are the comparative applicant reactions here? How do the applicant reactions for this test compare to the applicant reactions for other tests? So I would like to thank you very much. I look forward to talking with you at our break. Thank you very much.
Vamos a continuar con las conferencias.
Let's move on with the other speakers. We have two speakers now. We are going to be hearing from Antonio García Izquierdo and Francisco Abad. As Vicente said, Julio had to leave, so I'm going to be reading the kind words he left us to introduce the speakers. Antonio León García Izquierdo is a professor at the Oviedo University, and he chairs the Asturias chair on prevention. Antonio León García Izquierdo was invited to talk about a topic on which he's written certain books and on which he's published several articles. I think that García Izquierdo's presentation will be very interesting because it deals with things which have come up during the previous presentation and also in the posters. You have the floor.
Bien, buenos
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for being here. Let me thank Vicente for having invited me here and allowing me to share our research we've been working on for several years. After the wonderful presentation of Nancy Tippins, it's going to be difficult to contribute something new, but that's what I'm going to try to do. Let me update a few things. Currently, I lead a project funded by the Ministry of Economy, the PUMA project, which looks into civil servants who are managements, and we look at impartiality in selection. So it's PUMA, evaluation and selection of public managers. Without further ado, let me continue. This is a picture I took last night in Madrid while I was walking around. I think you can see. I don't know whether this is electronic recruitment or not. It's a sign saying workers are needed. Send your resume to the following email address, alejandro888888@hotmail.com. I don't know what you think about this. Is this very typical? Is it innovative? We're going to try to determine what exactly it means in the next few minutes. Now, what am I going to be talking about? We're going to see an overview of recruitment and selection processes, the individual organization adjustment, the social media. Will that make it easier to find that adjustment? We'll also be talking about recruitment and what is called e-recruitment. And then I'll talk about our research work. And I'll try to make it more accessible. We're first going to look about an article which is going to be published, and then the other part that I'm going to be addressing relates to an article that has already been published. It's hard to deny today, and I think we all agree on that, it's hard to deny that social media is pervasive in the area of human resources. And there are many studies, such as the study of the Society for Human Resources Management, which is widely referred to, and it seems that over half of the organizations use social media to find candidates, especially LinkedIn and Facebook. This also says that the JobVite employment portal says that 93% of recruiters look at the candidate's profile in the social media. So it seems recruiters don't trust the information sent to them by candidates. And half of them have reconsidered their selection decision based on what they find in the social media. And this is something that needs to be taken into account because this raises a lot of problems, as we'll see later. Also, there's a recent study, 2011, which suggests that 100% of new graduates are willing to interact with companies online. So, technology is no longer a problem, or at least for a specific generation, because Nancy was talking about the digital divide regarding which workers are more likely to use the social media, and that has an impact. I would now like to move on to basic elements which we shouldn't overlook, because we can mix the ends and the means, and sometimes the multimedia images makes us forget what we should be focusing on. And it's true that usually traditionally companies were in a dominant position in the relationship. The company hired and had all the power, and the candidate had to accept all of the directions, guidelines, conditions, because a job was at stake. But what has happened over the past few years, there's been a paradigm shift. We see this in more recent relationships where the candidate's perspective is increasingly taken into account. So it's not just a one-way street, the company hiring someone. It's a two-way street. The company hires and chooses, but candidates also decide the company of their choice, and they negotiate certain things. So the idea of adjustment, this bilateral negotiation, is something which brings up certain topics which weren't that important in the past, such as diversity, fairness, impartiality, especially in our country, because in the United States there have been very costly legal implications when the selection process hasn't been appropriate. But in our country, it seems that the situation isn't yet like it is in the United States. I wanted to highlight here that we can use models such as attraction, selection, attrition, Schneider's model, or with regard to the bilateral adjustment, we need to think about recruitment as matching the interests of both parties. If the individual is hired by the organization he wants to be hired by, then that individual will be more committed, and that might have a positive impact on performance, and a mismatch would lead to low satisfaction and stress. We see that in Christoph Braun and Guai's research work. I also like to highlight something from a research study of Porter, Lawther, and Hackman. There are two things. First, the employer branding, the attractiveness of a company, and also the fact that the candidate considers accepting a job in that organization, and depending on the information the candidate receives, decides to rule him or herself out or not. And this is very useful because we did an empirical study and we saw that recruitment aspects which relate to social and demographic factors and which can be discriminatory, such as gender, having had children or not, and so on. All that can make people feel that they don't belong to that group. And there are candidates who are potentially good who might exclude themselves from the process. In this individual organization, we have the internet, and we're now in a world which requires us to think hard because we're talking about virtual reality. What happens on the internet, is it real? Is it not real? Is it a virtual reality? Is it a new way to introduce oneself? Does it really correspond to what people are, to the what they want to portray? Well, there are studies that suggest that impression management is enhanced, it's promoted. That is, that one's image is improved. We have studies that suggest that the social media promote self-promotion, and it's easy for individuals that are using the internet post pictures, recent pictures of themselves, and have a lot of likes from their groups. So it would be necessary to see whether recruiters look at how many pictures people post and how many likes and dislikes they have. That could be an indicator. There have even been differences in gender roles. Men when they portray themselves on the internet are more instrumental and less emotional. And it seems that the classical roles are seen on the internet. Women are more expressive, more emotional, and put up more pictures. That means that the individual organization relationship on the internet is mediated. So we need to see whether the information on the internet is reliable and whether it's valid to consider that information. And this raises a number of questions. First of all, to what extent do companies see the recruitment process as a bilateral negotiation, or do companies continue to think that they're the strongest of the two and that candidates have to do whatever the company says? So does the company impose itself or not, especially in a global environment where highly skilled individuals with good verbal abilities and knowing a lot of foreign languages have a more global perspective of the work environment. So if the company doesn't want me, I can go elsewhere, and I'm less attached to a specific country. Another question that is raised is whether the high unemployment rate in Spain means that candidates are seen as a powerless party. It's different in countries where the unemployment rate is lower, whereas in Spain, in the under 26, the unemployment rate stands at 50%, more or less. And in the general population, the unemployment rate stands at between 20 and 25%. So 1 in 4 persons wants to work and can't work, and that means they might be in a weaker negotiating position. And the last question is whether on the internet, on websites of companies which put up information and on the social media, because of those websites, are there candidates who withdraw from the process? There are some companies who ask candidates their Facebook password to see what information is posted. Is that a violation of privacy? To what extent is that necessary? Why is the company interested in that kind of information? I read this morning. I don't know whether you're aware of this, but there seems to be a controversy with a soccer player, a woman from the Atlético de Madrid team, whose contract was not extended because there were pictures of her celebrating the victory of a rival team. And that was that's news from today. And why can't she celebrate the victory of a rival team who's from the same city? Is that a lack of alignment with the organization? Is it that? It's soccer, but there's more to it than that. Anyway, I just wanted to raise this. Regarding the social media and recruitment, Nancy has already provided a lot of information. I have very little to add, but I would like to say a couple of things. First, this specificity, there's a new cyberspace. It's a special place. The users can become viral. They can become advertisers. They can send positive and negative information on the company. So I'm sure that many of us here today, if we travel to any city tomorrow and we want to choose a hotel, we first probably look at comments on the internet on the hotel. We look at user comments. What is on the internet has a lot of weight today. You can create a public or semi-public profile. And that means that you have a closed or an open system depending on what the user wishes. On Facebook, you can limit who can access your information, but it could be that not everybody knows how to use those tools properly in order to protect themselves. So that public and semi-public profile, well, to what extent does it work? And according to a Boyd and Ellison study, you create a specific personality online, specific to the internet, or is it a real profile? That's a question I have. It seems that companies in Spain have progressively turned to the social media to look for candidates. The larger the company, the more they use the internet. 52% in gray, 52% of searches. And that's interesting to our topic. We should look at the advantages and disadvantages of using the social media. It seems there are studies that suggest that employers think they will know what the personality of candidates are through their profiles. What research suggests, however, is that reliability isn't very high because there are no tools. So it seems to be more instinctive, based on impressions. Do they look at the latest information? It's a dynamic process. This information changes every day. There's also interaction. Interaction among friends or among professionals. So it's in an interaction context, and that needs to be analyzed. The number of contacts of a candidate, spelling, and that's one of the things that is more closely looked at. Spelling and accuracy, recommendations, personal information revealed, all of that are important factors. That search has a low cost, obviously, and also we can see what Crows and Smith said recently about all of this. So the main objective is to verify how true resumes are and know what the social capital of the candidate is. It's also about enhancing the information which isn't on the resume, because you can lie on your resume, but you can lie elsewhere as well. The previous speaker talked about cheating. Is impression management cheating or not? When you want something, you sell yourself. In a good sense, you want to give a good impression. You see that in people seeking jobs. It's constantly updated, that's another advantage. It customizes communication and so on. When you're recruiting someone, it really helps if there is an email account just for candidates and you can screen them. You can use keywords as well to screen candidates. What are the disadvantages? Of course, there are also disadvantages. The first one is that you might take into account false information or information that could be misconstrued because of the context. There's a 2009 study where candidates state that they introduce fake information in the forms and so on, performance evaluations and so on. I work more in research now, but I used to work with organizations, and it's true that resumes are padded. There are techniques to portray a better image, and we need to ask ourselves whether that's really bad. If I look for someone for a job requiring social skills, and it's important to predict that person's performance, to see how assertive that person is. So it really depends on the position. Being influenced by information that is not related to future performance. This is important. Nancy referred to this earlier. There are things that are either not legal or that are on the fringe of legality, or they're not ethical, they're not best practices. The things people say on social media, on their private lives, is that really related with the criterion? It would be difficult to justify that. The Madeira study of 2012 on how candidates assess companies that use the social media. They see them as less fair and impartial, because I think we should be talking about and differentiating between professional social media and non-professional social media. Maybe candidates don't have a problem with professional social media, but on non-professional social media it would be easier to prove that there is a violation of privacy. There was also a very recent study, 2015. There was a sample of 500 students, and many of them were, I guess 60% were against the use of the social media for employment decisions. It seems that the millennials who handle technology very well, they're not migrants, they're natives, technology natives, and they say, that generation says that they post information, but they don't agree with employers using that information for making that kind of decision, because they're more private networks. And there's also recruitment. We all know what it's about. It's about attracting skilled individuals for a job position. Skilled workers who have the KSAO. The company's image has to be enhanced nowadays, because to the extent my brand as an employer is well developed, I can attract more talent. What about e-recruitment? We have information from the Telecommunications Observatory, and it seems that a high percentage of companies consider e-recruitment to be useful, and they post information to recruit individuals. It has a lot of advantages. It provides updated information, and it also makes direct communication with the candidate possible without taking into account time or place. So it's a major advantage. So, as I was saying, it's a cheaper process. Information is up to date. It seems there are no reasons not to use e-recruitment, especially taking into account internet penetration in Spain. It's true that there's a digital divide, and the disadvantage would be that some older candidates might not have access to those job offers. But it does allow for good recruitment. And these are the questions that are raised by all of this. Are organizations ready to take on the technological challenge? Is the image of the company well taken care of? Do candidates receive feedback? Do they develop the customer brand, the employer branding? Our main concern has to do with biodata, their personal history and their experience, the experience of candidates. It's pretty predictive, 0.30, 0.40, and usually candidates do not cheat on this information. But the problem is that they could have an adverse impact by leaving out certain groups. What we did at the time was the following. We thought that the 2007 Act on Equality between men and women in Spain, that law could be a good time to see to what extent recruitment and equality matters were taken into account by companies quoted on the Spanish Stock Exchange. So we took measurements in 2005 and 2009, that is 2 years before the law was passed. There were already drafts, and we knew the law was going to be passed, and after the law was passed. The idea was to see to what extent companies were aware of the legislative changes and to what extent they decided to include those changes on their websites, because websites are public websites. So it could be that a company might not want to take into account those things when acting privately, but on a website, and when we looked at the stock exchanges, a company's websites, well, a lot of those companies had a specific form. Other companies had an email address where people could send the information. Others had both, and others had a form, an email address, and also a recruitment message. And going back to the objective of the study, we knew that other studies had shown how things such as citizenship, place of birth, marital status, age, disability, all of that had a potential for discrimination. There's a study by in Stone which showed that very clearly. It was there was potential for litigation. And the company could be sued. So, to what extent could there be a direct or an indirect impact? We could ask managers whether they discriminated against some candidates, but of course the answer was obvious. If they do discriminate, they're not going to say so. So that's why we needed to look at things indirectly. So we looked at the websites and the forms, the application forms on the websites. First, there was a sample of 186 organizations that were quoted on the stock exchange. But what's the problem? The problem is that between 2005 and 2009, some companies were taken out of the stock exchange and others not. So, but the sample was sufficient. We also looked at the discourses. We looked at what companies used to attract talent. We saw different things. We didn't see any problem regarding discriminatory content because the terms had, and the content had to do with processes, teamwork, words and expressions having to do with the organization and with standard human resources policy. Training, globalization. Most of these discourses were written using the masculine words and not feminine words. But that's accepted in Spanish, masculine plural. Regarding the differences, In many of the forms, there were forms asking what the gender was. That would be banned in the United States. And here we would have to look into it. Marital status, number of children, and that's a pretty clear proxy for discrimination, because traditionally that's meant that women are adversely affected by it and not men. They're positively affected. At least that was the way it was traditionally. We'd have to see whether it's still like that. And also military service. This was in 2005 and 2009. And that question remained on the forms even though the military service was no longer compulsory. Here you have all the information. I don't want to go into too many details. I'd like to just point out the most salient issues. There were questions on disabilities. In 2005 and 2009, 5 and 4 companies asked whether the candidate had relatives in the organization. That's controversial, but it's true that there are collective bargaining agreements where hiring relatives is promoted. Weight, height, parents' relations, why? And other things which seem more normal, such as, or rather parents' name, driver's license, things that are more typical, driver's license, economic objectives, also a picture where you can see race, and that would be controversial in some countries. So we looked at the changes between 2005 and 2009, and we realized that some companies improved and took that new legislation into account, whereas other companies did worse after the legislative change. And we're talking about companies that are quoted on the stock exchange. They're not small or medium-sized companies where you can say, well, this is a small company and so on. Here, they're major companies, but it's still striking. We tried to see whether there was a relationship between that result and profits. It seems that the more discriminatory companies had made more profits, or rather more revenue. And these are the conclusions we reached. And this leads me to ask myself the following. Are companies really careful about the information they post on the web? And also, if we'd like to check that information on the social media, what's the difference between a private detective? Are we allowed to go into people's homes, to open drawers to see whether the degree is there or not? I think the internet provides great opportunities, but it has its limitations, and to the extent possible, I think privacy and respect for the right of everyone's honor should be respected. So I think you can select staff using best practices and having valid and reliable information which is related to the job position. And this is my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Bueno, pues vamos con la última conferencia del.
Let's move on to the last speaker now, Francisco Abad, who is a colleague and a friend, and we could say a lot about him, and everything would be good. Paco is a tenured lecturer here. He's an expert in psychometrics, and his articles are published in the most renowned international publications. There are thousands of references to his work. He's been invited here because he has greatly contributed to internet tests used in Spain. And he is also an author of at least 4 of these tests, so he is an expert in cats. Thank you for being here, Paco, and we'll leave the questions for the end.
Well, first of all, thank you all very much for this introduction, and I hope that you haven't put the bar too high, because I'm just the working bee here in the team. I'm going to organize my talk around several chapters. I'm going to give you a general overview on what we call ties, which is cats. And then I will be speaking about multidimensional and some stage testing and ipsative testing. And I'll try and illustrate my descriptions with different examples. What are cats? Probably you already know this. Well, the idea is we have an item bank with many different questions, and the idea is to be given each candidate, each applicant, different items. What do you need to build up a cat? You need an item bank, but items are not only the questions, but also you need to know the statistical model underlying those questions. So you need to have a model, the likelihood of the response to a given question. For instance, for people with a high skill level, we will be then administering very high, highly difficult tests, and so on and so forth. So we need to know the properties of the different items in the bank. Then we have the adaptive algorithm, and this will tell us how to select best items, so the most suitable items for each individual. What the features of cats? Well, efficiency and accuracy. With an adapted test, you can measure very well extreme levels, whereas a fixed test wouldn't let us do that. CAT is safer because you are using different items for each individual, so there is less a chance of cheating. And it's more adaptive because you will be adapting your items to their abilities. And this is quite important, effectiveness, the effectiveness size. If you want to measure many different things, you need to solve problems like fatigue. If you are using a personality test and then someone has to respond to 240 items, it's very likely that this person will end up exhausted, and this is not going to happen with a cat. Cats began in the 80s, in the early 90s, mostly in the US for educational purposes, for admission to college, for selection and screening for the army. And then the number of cats has been on the rise in the last few years. We have different ones here in Spain. The cats, matrices, and others have been developed in Spain. We have at least 20 operational programs, and somewhere between 4 to 20 million people in the world are assessed by means of cats. So this is quite trendy, so to speak. Research and adaptive testing is also on the rise, as well as the literature. It's been now under research, and it's making progress. Some people in the 90s had some pessimistic views on this, but in spite of all that, it has proven that it works. What has been researched in the last few years? Well, research has focused on two major objects, the algorithms and exposure control. If I could summarize everything about selection algorithms, I would say that the idea that you need to select or to choose the most suitable items for each individual, well, you have seen that this is not the right way to go. Because when are you selecting those items? At the very beginning, when you don't know nothing about the individual, you don't know nothing about their different trait levels. If we did that at the beginning, that would be wrong. And it's not important, I mean, not only because we are wasting our best items at the beginning, but because if I apply a very discriminatory item at the beginning of the test and the person, the individual, fails, gets it wrong, maybe because it's just the beginning of the test, then it could create a bias for the rest of the test. I've told you that each individual is given a different test, but ever since the beginning of adaptive testing, we saw that at the end, the best items were always the same. So we tend to always use those. And we have to try and avoid to do that. And so you set up controls to the number of times you can use them. Control to exposure is not only important to avoid that overexposure, but also to make it possible that certain items that are not as good but are not bad either are also used. So these algorithms for exposure control also make it possible to use other items that are not as good but not bad either when at the beginning of the test. Well, a non-adaptive, a very good example of this would be what we call TAI matrices, which is CAT matrices. This allows you to measure general intelligence within an ability range. It's 54 items, rather it's 149 items that have been calibrated in a sample of 12,380 individuals, and this is what we use for it. A third line of research was the restriction control. We were speaking about selection algorithms, exposure controls, and the third line of research was restriction control. What is the problem with the CAT? Each individual is completing a different test, and in each CAT you only select items regarding depending on certain elements such as information. And there's a problem. Maybe some people are getting items always related to the same type of content if it's a knowledge test. And we want the CAT to reflect all of the different contents. And sometimes the best discriminating items are the ones with more text in them. And then those people would take longer in completing the test. And this type of thing is very difficult to anticipate if I don't set up certain controls. What is then the restriction control? For instance, time of administration is not more than 90 minutes, for instance. The best method to do this is what we call the shadow testing. It's a methodology that was proposed by van der Linden, a Dutch psychometrist, and the idea was to maximize the information function by keeping restriction controls. What does this mean in practice? Whenever I administer a test to someone, the first thing I do is to try and have an overview of the whole test that I'm going to be administering. That test complies with all the restrictions, is not biased, has content is balanced. I'm going to select the best item. I administer it. Then he responds or she responds. And then what would be the best test, including that item? So this is a shadow test because in the end, at the end of the day, I might not be administering the test that I had initially planned for. But at the end of the day, what I'm administering the best possible test in that I could administer to this individual. This theory is somewhat complex, and tests that are administered in general use a more heuristic system to control restrictions. But anyway, apart from these lines of research in the last 15 years, what are the structural problems that gave rise to the next step? The two inherent problems of a cat are the following, the ones that you can see on the screen. When an individual is replying to a cat, they can only go forward. I'm given a question, I reply, I'm given another question, I then reply, but I can never go back and review my replies. And this is very uncomfortable for subjects because and you can never go back. And because sometimes when we are given tests, if a question is a bit difficult for us, we skip it and go to the next one, and then we try to go back and reply to the earlier one. And they said that in a CAT it was impossible to let people review, otherwise they would be able to use response strategies that would allow them to cheat. So reviewing is difficult in CATs, and trying to include that possibility. And a second problem is the sheer fact that each individual is given a different test. For test developers, this is, not really the best way to go. How can I control that the form that I have applied to this particular person is accomplishing everything I was setting out to accomplish? What is the solution to all of this? It's the multi-stage tests. I'm here showing you a fluid multi-stage intelligence test. You know that we psychometrists are really interested in measuring fluid intelligence. Well, it includes a knowledge test, a matrix test, but this is a test that an individual is building up the right option. So they would have to complete here with the right solution. What are the features, the standard features of a multi-stage test? First, the adaptive selection, instead of being done when for just one item, is done for blocks of items. So first, I would have a test with medium difficulty items. Then that would be the first block, the first test. Applicants would reply, and depending on their ability levels, if they do it very well, then we would administer them a high difficulty module, or an intermediate difficulty module, or a low difficulty module. The difference between this and the regular adaptive testing is the fact that we are using blocks or modules of items instead of individual items. This solves both problems that we saw earlier on here. The possibility of reviewing is introduced by means of the use of blocks or modules. When I'm in block 2, I can no longer review anything that I did in block 1. But whenever I'm still in the first module, I can always review everything in that module. Then the tests are more adaptive because the number of tests, depending on the route I take, I could go 7 different ways. These are the two advantages of multi-stage testing. I can control whether the form that I'm applying complies with all the different restrictions that it needs to comply with. Then the second innovation in CAT is related to the use of multidimensional models. And you will be able to see this very easily on the slide. Traditionally, we have been using unidimensional models. Let's just consider that we just want to measure orderliness here. Orderliness, and everything is aimed at that. But in a multidimensional test, we're not only measuring orderliness, but different traits, such as self-discipline, sense of duty, etc. And these traits are interrelated. So when someone is replying to an item about their sense of duty, they will also be answering something about orderliness, because someone who has a high sense of duty is also someone who is usually very orderly. So in these multidimensional tests, we are going to squeeze out the information in a more effective way. For instance, the Mikransky and Glass group wanted to build up a CAD for each of the different domains in the Big Five. When I analyze the 240 elements and the 6 traits per domain, I can see that the different traits are correlated in each domain. For instance, the neuroticism traits are correlated in 0.60, for instance. So this is going to be very useful. So what would happen if we applied the full NEO-PR bank, the 240 items together, and versus a unidimensional CAT? This would be reliability. This is the average reliability in each of the different traits, for instance, neuroticism. If I apply a CAT, even though it is a CAT, as I apply half of the items, because the CAT has half of the items and the full bank has 240, you lose accuracy. What happens if I apply then a multidimensional CAT? Well, I can reach a great and higher degree of accuracy because I'm using the whole bank. I'm using an algorithm that is taken in mind the fact that the different traits are correlated. So a greater effectiveness, the effectiveness is greater. The greater the correlation is, the greater of the efficiency. Then we also studying and researching the bifactorial CAT. What does this mean? Each item, I suppose, that is going to be measuring another trait. For instance, orderliness. They share elements with sense of duty and self-discipline. But so here, what I'm doing is trying to use the multidimensionality again, because we are measuring two items at the same time, but in this case it's intra-item, not inter-item. So we build 300 items to measure the Big Five, 6 traits, peer-reviewed, applied to a sample. And what does the simulation study tell us? With this CAT for responsibility, trying to take all the different items that measure it up. Well, here on the first column, what you can see is the correlation, the resulting correlation between the score when it is applied to the full item bank for responsibility, that would be full bank, and just one test with 12 items. The score in a 12-item test, that could be the optimal test, picking up always the best 12 items for everyone, or a one unidimensional CAT or multidimensional CAT. So what can we see here? When we apply the unidimensional CAT for personality issues, there is not really a significant difference between a unidimensional CAT and an optimum test. So but if we want to improve the accuracy of an optimum test, then we use a bifactor CAT. So with a multidimensional test, we are always improving accuracy. And the last breakthrough I wanted to talk to you about, I think it's the most interesting one, very appealing. Our group is also working on this, but it's mostly the job of Glasgow and colleagues in the University of Illinois. They have created what a tailored adapted personality assessment system with 4 choice items. The cat that they have built up is called Tapas. I hope it doesn't make you hungry. But it measures 22 personality traits in the big 5. And the idea behind it is for the user to be able to create a tailored test. For instance, I decide I want to measure these 4 or 5 traits. And then with Tapas, I can even decide in which format I want to work. If I'm going to work in a contest with a very high social disability, then I can choose Likert. If I think it's going to be a very high social desirability, then I can use the 4th choice format. So I can. It's sort of an a la carte test. So which are the main innovations in Tapas? Well, what I want to say is that the educational test and service is also using Tapas to create a skills measurement test. It's working very well in the US. It's been developed in the last 5 years, and as I said, it's doing very well. And what are the 2 major distinctive features of Tapas? Well, they use a forced selection or forced choice format. We know that the Likert format does not really work well. If I'm told I get along well with other people, I usually set my bar up very, very high. Well, everybody's going to say yes. I mean, that's a no-brainer. So in a forced choice context, we are going to group items for them to choose whatever they think that better represents them. So we are going to use 2 items with a very high social desirability. So I like telling people what they must do, or I return my phone calls in a short while. So you have to choose between 2 desirable traits answers. So by calibrating items, I can create ipsative blocks. Second feature, the type of model, psychometric model that behind Tapas items. You have, for instance, dominance models. For instance, like I enjoy talking to people. Well, the higher the extroversion of the person, the higher the likelihood of this person think that they are very well represented by this item. Whereas Tapas is going to it follows a model of the ideal point. So the probability function here is unimodal. For instance, the item, I'm as organized as everybody else. So who is going to be most in agreement with this? Well, someone who is average. If you are more organized than others, more tidier than others, then you are going to be in disagreement. And if you are not as tidy, then you're also going to be in disagreement with that. So the type of bottle and the type of format are the 2 distinctive features of Tapas. And Tapas is adaptive in a very interesting way. What Tapas does is calibrating, grading a number of questions or statements, such as I get along with others, I set the bar high. And once that you move on to lesser social desirability items, then in an adaptive manner, the individual will be given a 2-item block. And that 2-item block will be the best suited to measure the trait levels in that person. If I have 1,500 items, I can create as many blocks as I want. So the idea is for the 2 items in the block to be equally desirable, socially desirable. And, well, tapas then is resistant to cheating, so is sort of more cheat-proof than others. And for instance, these are criteria from the army, from the armed forces, and this has been used by the U.S. military. This shows the validity of tapas in 12 traits. Other research lines in the last few years, the development of algorithms to detect the deterioration of an item. We know that, well, this uncontrolled administration and unproctored administration, we cannot control many factors, but we can at least have statistical algorithms to detect when the parameters of an item, when the characteristic of that item are changing and are deteriorating. And we are also working on how to add new items to a bank. We are developing CADs to include new variables, new response variables, for instance, response times mentioned by Professor Tippins. They give us information about whether the person has unusual behavior. If someone knows or is familiar with, has prior knowledge of the items, they will be answering or replying much faster than others. And then the use of additional information. For instance, in CAD, we are using a verification test. What is a verification test? Well, it is a controlled environment test to determine whether the ability levels of a person are the same as they were in a non-controlled or an unproctored environment. And we detected there are not many changes. For instance, to see that whether there are changes in the command of a language. For instance, in command of English, for instance, of the English language, there's only a 13% difference. So an unproctored administration was not such a catastrophe after all. Well, I hope I have given you an overview about mathematical algorithms, what new lines of research are going on. And, well, this is just, a lot of work done by many people in our department. Some people are no longer with us, not because they have suffered any accidents, but because they have moved to the private sector. Thank you.
For Professor Tippin, we were talking before about this issue. Basically, what we do is compare the job and organizational requirements with the person competencies. But the challenge is we don't know how these competencies are going to be developed in the future, but most difficult is to predict what are the requirements in the future, where 50% of the jobs that we are currently performing now will not exist in a few years, and on the other hand, 50% of the future jobs do not exist now. So some people question the competency models as based in that kind of environment. But what are your opinions, and how can we try to see how the future job requirements can be matched against the people competencies? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that's really a critical question. The one thing that we can count on is that the world will change, and it will change more rapidly than it has changed in the past. And so the question becomes, how do we keep up with measuring people on knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics that are relevant for the job they do today as well as the job they do tomorrow? As I said earlier, in the United States, we are constrained by this law that says everything we measure has to be job relevant. But my contention is that one of the relevant competencies we need to measure is the ability to learn and change and adapt, and that you certainly have to have the KSAOs for the current job, but you also have to have the ability to acquire new KSAOs for the job of tomorrow. In our conversation earlier, I said in my dark days, in my black days, I despair, and I think that perhaps all we should ever measure is the ability to learn, as well as basic skills like problem-solving skills, interpersonal skills, and communication skills. That is probably too general for certain kinds of jobs at lower levels. It may not make sense, and you really do want people who understand mechanics or electronics or know how to sell. But for many, many jobs, you can count on them changing, and we have got to find a way to integrate measures that are relevant for today as well as for tomorrow. And I think that when we do future-oriented job analyses, that often comes up, that we are going to have to measure people on this ability to not only acquire the new knowledge, but to be flexible personally. It's a form of a personality trait, really, and to accept the change that's bound to come.
Hola. Bueno, muchas gracias.
Hello. Well, thank you, all three of you, for your presentations.
Desde el streaming una persona me ha contactado.
Someone called Julio Olea has contacted me via streaming, and he has a question for Dr. Abad. Given the very expensive cost of developing adaptive testing, in which context are those costs worth the while? When do you think that this investment is really worth it? Well, Weiner in 2000 said that when admission tests for college were used twice a year in given dates, and regularly, well, everything was much cheaper. Well, the development of adaptive testing, well, has entailed a much higher investment. We need to be applying tests on an ongoing basis. The computerized format is no longer an issue, or not such a major issue. I believe that an adaptive test is always going to be a better investment, mostly for cognitive tests. For personality tests, it's quite unclear that an adaptive test is going to be much better than using an optimum test. Why? Because when you use a personality test, due to the fact that you are using a rating or grading your response or your degree to say whether you agree in different levels, then it's the individual who is actually grading its response. So I don't think it's that useful. But in yes and no formats, well, if they are dichotomies, then you can miss a lot of information. So building an adaptive test can be very effective. Weiner in 2000 said that we were blinded by the light of adaptive testing, and when that glare had disappeared, we had started to see the actual issues that they had. Well, I don't think that's really the case, but in some cases it's true that expenses and costs are really flare up, and the idea is to use the most appropriate tests in every case. For instance, you don't need to measure up all the different skills. Well, you might not be needing and to develop an adaptive testing depends on the purpose. Sometimes you just need to know what you're using it for.
Aquí hay una pregunta.
Another question? I'd like to thank you, the three of you, for your presentations. My question, well, it's for the three of you, actually, about the new things that we want to measure, because we've been speaking about constructs and methodologies and, you know, the classics, personality, inductive reasoning, you know, the best match for an organization for a given job. Do you see in the future any new construct to be assessed that we are not doing now, that we're not assessing now? New things, new skills, new abilities in the market, and maybe, yeah, what's happening, competency being assessed. Is there any new construct or new skills or abilities that you consider will be relevant in the future, relevant to be assessed in the future? Well, you know, off the cuff, and now, you know, thank you for the question, by the way. You know, this matching element needed to be the best match for a given post. Well, the validity of a test depends on whether the job analysis has been done right and that the testing is also well suited. If we don't know what the jobs are going to be, we will not know what the job description is going to be or what skills they will need. So this is quite a challenge. In research, you need to analyze. I mean, now the analysis of job analysis had been a bit lagging behind, but now with these new jobs coming up, I think that this topic is again coming under the spotlight. So, to what extent can you measure? I don't know. You know, as you know, as equity. Can you measure as equity the likes that your friends have given in Facebook, for instance? And is this, well, maybe is this an asset for you? I mean, I don't know. I mean, how can you measure that? Is this relevant to the post itself? Is this I don't know. Are there other factors? And is there, you know, is there any discrimination involved? And the other factors to take into account, for instance, the privacy law and personal information protection law. You can only use data which are person appropriate and relevant. You cannot go anywhere beyond that. And from internet, there's only so much that you can collect. And the equal opportunity law says that you have to justify to what extent the information that you're requesting is relevant for that particular position. In my paper, I think I mentioned this, you have to really define what's relevant, what's appropriate, what's fair for a given position, because from that, then you will have to decide what skills and abilities you're going to assess. I think that we are wading through uncertainty now. I don't know whether I have answered your question, but I just wanted to clarify this. I don't know whether you have anything else to add. Well, I fully agree. I'm not really experienced in human resources, but I think there are several dimensions here which are quite general, like personality and general skills. I think this will always be a predictive. I mean, we can predict from one individual's behavior. There are studies that show that, you know, in the Kaczynski studies, you know, from someone's behavior in Facebook, his likes or her likes, then you can also predict some behaviors. And I think that these are, you know, for personality construct, they are 100 years old now. And the new constructs, I believe, will come driven by, you know, new technologies and others, yes. But as for personality and intelligence, I don't think that, you know, anything new will be coming up. For instance, the tapas being used now for the educational services in the U.S., instead of speaking about traits, maybe traits seem a bit old-fashioned. They use composites like teamwork, but at the end of the day, these are composites of different traits that have been structured in a way to be able to predict whatever behavior you want to predict.
I agree with what you just said. I think that psychologists have done a pretty good job of developing the taxonomies of cognitive abilities and non-cognitive abilities. About 15 years ago, the Department of Labor in the United States sponsored a study called the ONET, and it is a huge database of tasks and general work activities and personality traits, everything. And they studied all different kinds of jobs. It's not perfect, believe me. There are lots of problems with it, but it is a pretty good description of what we know about the constructs that underlie job performance. So I think we've done a pretty good job at defining what those are. I think in the future we can expect the relative importance of some of these things to change. There's been a little bit of research talking about changes in constructs and a little bit of over time, but also as people progress in levels. And so what you find is that what's important for this job may not be the same as for this same job tomorrow, or for the supervisory position of this job. So that the good example is that in the past, conscientiousness, duty, following directions, those things were really important. You still need to do some of that. I mean, that doesn't go away, and that construct hasn't disappeared, but now the emphasis more is on adaptability and flexibility, the willingness to learn and change and adapt to the environment. So I think you'll see some changes there. What I do think you'll see in the internet and the computerized testing has huge advantages is in the ways we measure those kinds of things. And so the TAPIS work that Fritz is doing is a really good example that we're measuring the same constructs, but we're doing it in somewhat different ways. In some more of my black days, I also worry that we have not capitalized on the promise of technology to the extent that we have, and that many of our tests are still the same types of items that we've used just on paper and pencil. We put them on a computer, and the computer's a really nice page turner. Where the real sort of the big monumental leaps that we've made in our profession, I think, tend to be in these processes for understanding what test scores mean. So things like computer adaptive testing or item response theory, those are really great technological leaps that help us understand those constructs better.
Muy bien, muy bien. Para terminar.
Good. Now, 3 things to conclude. First, we'll be sending you a survey to get your feedback. 2, we have 150 people who connected via streaming, more than last year. 3rd, let's give Noli a hand because she organized everything this year. Last year it was Isabel, who's now in the United States, and probably listening to us through streaming. So she's going to know that we've had this meeting again. So please give Noli a hand for all her hard work. Thank you all, and we hope to see you next year at our 9th seminar. Thank you.